Chapter 1477. Shui emo, this seat will let you off this once. You're on your own. He didn't look at her anymore. Turning around, he waved his hand towards Luzine. A ball of white light flashed, and Luzine on the ground revealed her original form. Originally snow-white nine-tailed fox, but now its fur was dirty, most of it dyed red with blood. Its originally watery eyes were left with 2 bloody holes, and most of its tongue was missing. Its 4 limbs were broken, and there were several bone-deep wounds on its body. Flesh lacerated. Truly flesh lacerated. It was paralyzed there, its body trembling non-stop. Shinjioli frowned. Raising his sleeve, a white light shot out, enveloping the fox in a barrier. Then, he turned around and left with it. He had to treat it immediately, or else it would really be crippled. It was implicated by him, and also came to pick herbs for him. Now that it was tortured to this state, he couldn't absolve himself of the blame. He didn't want to look at Ning Shuama anymore, in case he couldn't control his anger and really killed her. He flew up, and behind him came Ning Shuama's faint whisper, like a curse, "Shinjioli, you'll regret it." Shinjioli's feet paused slightly. Just as he was about to turn around, he saw a red figure flying in this direction from the corner of his eye, Shuilan. He still appeared in the end. Shinjioli didn't want to be entangled with him at this time. Without any hesitation, a white light flashed, and he disappeared in the air. The surroundings regained its tranquility. On the ground, there were broken trees, rolling boulders, and dripping blood. The wind blew, blowing Ning Shuama's messy hair. There was still the smell of blood in the air. Ning Shuama sat with her back against the big tree, not getting up. She was too lazy to use her psychokinesis to control it. Blood gushed out from between her legs again, stream after stream, as if it was endless. Through her blood-stained skirt, it formed a small blood puddle on the ground, and that blood puddle was rapidly expanding. She looked up at the sky, towards the depths of the white clouds. "Baby, I'm sorry. Mommy is useless. I didn't get revenge for you. Mommy is coming to accompany you. It's lonely on the road to the netherworld. Let's keep each other company." When Shui Lan arrived, he saw this scene. Ning Shuama was lying on the ground, covered in blood. Her eyes were staring blankly at the sky, motionless. "Momo." Shui Lan's legs almost went soft. He was stunned for a moment before he rushed over and hugged her in his arms. "Momo, which bastard hurt you?" Ning Shuama stared blankly at the sky. She didn't seem to see him, nor did she struggle. Her entire body seemed to have fallen into a void world, and she was no longer able to sense anything that was happening outside. "Momo?" Shui Lan could feel that her body was gradually turning cold, and her face was getting paler and paler. Under the sunlight, her lips were so pale that they were almost transparent. It was as if the slightest touch would shatter her entire body. Shui Lan's heart was beating wildly. This was the first time he saw her in such a dispirited and desperate state. Although she was still alive, she seemed to have lost all her vitality. Her whole body was covered in blood, but her skirt was not torn. He couldn't see any wounds either. Where exactly was she bleeding? Shui Lan was determined to check her injuries, but when he reached out his hand, he seemed to have thought of something and paused. His Momo didn't like him touching her body. Because of this, she had fought with him several times. He froze for a moment before he finally asked, "Momo, where are you hurt?" I'll stop the bleeding first." She couldn't let it continue like this. She would bleed to death. Chapter 1478. Ning Shuama acted as if she didn't hear his question. Although her eyes were wide open, they didn't reflect any light. They were as dead as a black hole. Shui Lan was frightened by her expression. He had seen Ning Shuama disappear into the black hole when he was in the outer space. He tried his best to find the black hole, but he could not find it no matter how hard he tried. Like a headless fly, he passed through one space door after another. In the end, he lost his way and could not find his way home. Passing through the space door required a sufficient amount of psychokinesis. He tried his best not to consume too much psychokinesis. In order to find Ning Xuema, he could only find a place to rest when he was at the end of his tether. After a while, his body could not take it anymore. He fell seriously ill on a foreign planet. Unfortunately, the planet was full of primitive people. There was almost no civilization. Naturally, there were no herbs to cure his illness. Moreover, the environment there was very bad. He could not absorb enough spiritual energy. This illness almost took his life. If he did not have a protective barrier around him, the primitive people and wild beasts on the planet would have eaten him. This illness trapped him on the planet for 8 years. If he used his sorcery to suck the blood and souls of the primitive people, he might be able to recover faster. However, when he caught the primitive people and was about to use his sorcery, he suddenly remembered Ning Xuema. She seemed to hate killing. In the end, he released the primitive people and relied on cultivation to recover bit by bit. After his body recovered more than half, he could not wait to leave the planet. After another round of searching, he finally found the door to this space door 2 years later and came back. He still had a tiny hope in his heart. He wanted to see if Ning Xuema had come back. After asking around, he heard that Ning Xuema danced as a gift during the engagement ceremony of the Sun-Moon Sextizun. He was happy but worried at the same time. He immediately began to search for Ning Xuema's whereabouts. After many twists and turns, he finally found her. He finally saw her after 10 years. She was bathed in blood. She was dying. No matter what he asked her, it was as if she couldn't hear a thing. She was like a lifeless porcelain doll, and even her eyelashes were transparent. He held her in his arms, and she was as light as a leaf that could break at any moment. The blood on her dress dripped down along the corner of her clothes, almost forming a line of blood. She was still bleeding. Shuilan was so anxious that cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He was about to risk being cut by her in the future to check her body. Suddenly, he realized that Ning Xuema was staring straight at him. His heart skipped a beat. "Momo, did you see me? Where are you bleeding? Let me stop the bleeding first." "The child is gone," she murmured. She seemed to be sober and confused at the same time. "I couldn't avenge it. I'm useless." Shuilan felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He almost threw Ning Xuema to the ground. Child? She had a child? She was bleeding because of a miscarriage? Shuilan lowered his head to look at her. His eyes were filled with complicated emotions. Ning Xuema, who was in his arms, suddenly moved slightly. She raised one of her hands as if she wanted to touch something. A smile appeared on her face. "Baby, you're here to pick up Mommy. Mommy will go with you." Her words came to an abrupt end. Her eyes slowly closed, and her hand fell limply to her side. Shuilan's mind was blown. His fingers trembled as he touched her wrist. Then, his expression changed drastically. He flew up with her in his arms. "Momo, don't be afraid. I'll save you. I won't let you die. It's okay. Don't be afraid." Chapter 1479. Luzine's injuries were extremely severe. After Shinjioli transformed her into a fox, he lifted his finger to stop her bleeding. Its eyeballs had been dug out while it was still alive, and its eyeballs had been completely destroyed by Ning Xuema. It was in so much pain that it kept trembling. Within the protective barrier that he had set up for it, it was in a daze and had no intention of waking up. Its injuries were too severe. Even within the healing barrier that he had set up for it, it was still getting weaker and weaker. Its flower of life was like a candle in the wind, about to be extinguished at any time. He couldn't delay any longer. He couldn't delay a single second. As for how it had met Ning Xuema and why they had fought, he would investigate these reasons in the future. But right now, saving people was more important. He had to save them first. After Shinjioli returned, he started to treat its injuries. Chest, stomach, eyes, mouth, limbs, there were penetrating wounds everywhere, and many of its organs were failing. It could be seen how ruthless the person who had done this was. Fortunately, it was a nine-tailed fox that had already cultivated to the heaven tier. Otherwise, these injuries would have already taken its life. Shinjioli looked at the wounds on its body, and his fingers stiffened. It wasn't that he had never seen people kill people, but it was really rare to see people kill people to such an extent. This was simply a type of cruel torture. In the end, what kind of conflict did Ning Xuema have with it for her to be so ruthless? It was as if they were mortal enemies. Ning Xuema's eyes, which were filled with hatred, flashed before his eyes, and his heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. Ning Xuema's nature wasn't very kind, and he had long known about this. All these years, he had been investigating her both openly and secretly. Although it was a secret that Ning Xuema had used underhanded methods to skin Tui Dao alive, with the help of the Sun Moon sect's vast intelligence network, Shinjioli still found out about it. Of course, he knew that she had done it to protect herself, and Tui Dao was indeed not a good person. He didn't feel pity for Tui Dao at all. However, it was indeed shocking that a young girl like her could do such a thing. From this incident, it could be seen that she could be ruthless when necessary. After all, he was once the successor of the fiend ancestor. Being vicious and merciless was also a means of survival. Everything he knew about Ning Xuema was negative, so when he saw her brutally torturing Luzine, he was so angry that he didn't even think about why she was doing it. Now that he had calmed down, he began to have doubts. With Ning Xuema's character, she wouldn't do such a thing to Luzine if she didn't have any enmity with her. His gaze fell on the unconscious nine-tailed fox in front of him. Or did Luzine provoke her? But if it was just an ordinary provocation, it wouldn't have provoked such a huge hatred. The image of Ning Xuema flashed before his eyes again. She was covered in blood, and there was not a single spot on her body that was not covered in blood. She was smiling like a demon from hell, and she was even going to attack Luzine in front of him. His heart suddenly began to race. Did Luzine do something irreversible to Ning Xuema? Was that why, if he wanted to know the truth, he only needed to read Luzine's memory to know everything? However, the person needed to be awake to read the memory, and Luzine was now unconscious and dying. Woo! The nine-tailed fox unconsciously let out a painful groan, and her body began to tremble again. He actually got distracted when Luzine was about to die. Shinjioli finally regained his senses, and his eyes darkened. Chapter 1480. He had to save it first. When it woke up, he would read its memories. He forced himself to calm down and began to heal Luzine. Time passed slowly. By the time he finished healing it, 4 hours had already passed. All the wounds on its body had stopped bleeding and the places that needed to be stitched up had been stitched up. After a few months of rest, it should be able to fully recover. However, its tongue and eyes could not be healed. He had to leave it as it was and find a replacement in the future. This was the most difficult time for him to control his emotions when he was healing someone. While he was treating Luzine's injuries, Ning Xuema's eyes, which were filled with hatred, flashed in front of his eyes. This made him restless. Ever since he met her again, he had not been able to calm down. Awoo! The nine-tailed fox that was enveloped by his white light moaned in pain. Its white fur trembled even more. Shinjioli looked down at it. He had raised many pets in his life and many of them were injured. Thus, he was quite familiar with healing them. He had always been a clean person. Whether it was healing animals or humans, he would try his best to avoid physical contact with the other party. This was especially true when it came to females who had cultivated their human forms. Except for that fox from 3,000 years ago, that fox loved to cling to him regardless of whether it was in its human form or its fox form. At first, he resisted, but later on, he got used to it. I can't think about her anymore. Shinjioli suppressed his chaotic thoughts and focused on healing Luzine. After he was done, Luzine was still in a semi-conscious state. He could not read its memories right away. He stood there for a moment and then walked out. The scenery outside was still the same. Apart from his main hall, there were no other halls on the Tianyin Peak. He looked at where the side hall used to be. After 10 years, not a single trace of the side hall could be seen. In its place, there was a large field of herbs. The herbs in the field swayed with the breeze. There was a field of herbs that had bloomed with bright red flowers. The flowers were as red as the morning sun. Unconsciously, he walked over and touched the flowers. In a trance, the flowers seemed to have turned into Ning Xuema's bloody clothes. Shinjiuli, I hate you. His hand trembled, and he took a step back. The flower was still the flower, not that person. Ning Xuema's figure followed him like a shadow, appearing and disappearing from time to time. His heart inexplicably panicked and tightened. It was as if the most important thing in his life was rapidly leaving him. His gaze finally landed on his clothes. There was still a mouthful of blood that she had spat out. He was obsessed with cleanliness. Normally, he would never let a mouthful of blood get on his body, let alone let the blood stain stay on his body for so long. It was something that could be removed with a cleansing spell, but he didn't want to remove it. He stared blankly at the bloodstains for a moment and walked around the courtyard a few times. In the end, he summoned Yelu Jing and told him a location, asking him to quickly investigate the whereabouts of Ning Xuema and Shui Lan. Before he left, he saw Shui Lan appear. Without a doubt, they should be together now. Nothing would happen to her. The ancestor's order was extremely urgent. Yelu Jing did not dare to delay and went to arrange it personally. Shinjiuli walked around the same place again. The uneasiness in his heart grew stronger. The voice transmission talisman on his waist suddenly lit up. He picked it up and Yelu Jing's voice came through urgently. Chapter 1481. Master, the spies in the capital of Chongkong Empire just sent news that Shui Lan was carrying a bloody lady crazily begging for treatment. He has already smashed several medical centers. What? The cup in Shinjiuli's hand slipped and fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. Who is he carrying? He heard his own voice wavering. Although he was 99% sure, he did not dare to believe it. I heard that it's junior sister. Shinjiuli's fingers trembled. For Shui Lan to disregard his identity as a demon to appear and beg for treatment, her injuries must be very critical. How could it be? That's impossible. How could her injuries be so serious? Obviously, at that time, he saw Ning Xuema torturing Lizine like a demon from hell. Her methods were so cruel that it made one's hair stand on end. In a fit of rage, he slapped her away. He knew that his slap was a little heavy, but he knew his limits. It should be within the range that she could endure. At most, it would only make her spit out a few mouthfuls of blood. It would not endanger her life. Her body was stained with Lizine's blood, and there were no other wounds on her body. Furthermore, she was full of energy when torturing people, so her body should be fine. How could it be? Did any of the doctors that he found survive? What did they say? Shinjiuli suppressed the panic in his heart and asked in a low voice. The spies there have already asked. They all said that the lady is like a lamp that has run out of oil. They can't save her. Shinjiuli's voice transmission talisman fell to the ground. Master. I also heard some news. I don't know if it's true or not. Speak. The spies said that he had asked several doctors. 2 of them told him that the lady had a miscarriage and was bleeding profusely. Miscarriage? Bleeding profusely? These 5 words were like a series of thunderbolts, shocking Shinjiuli so much that his face turned pale and he was almost speechless. She was pregnant? Pregnant? Who was it? His mind was buzzing and his mind was blank. His hands and feet were ice cold. No. Now is not the time to care about this. She had a miscarriage and was bleeding profusely. It can't be my palm strike, like a lamp that has run out of oil. there is no way to save the desperate situation. Ning Xuema, was she going to die? Master, master. Disciple has also heard that Shui Lan has caused such a huge commotion that it has already alerted the other immortal cultivation sects. Many of the immortal cultivation sects experts are already on their way there. Master. The sound transmission talisman on the ground transmitted Yelu Jing, Anne's report, but no one was listening anymore. The wind blew and the talisman drifted into the distance, and then slowly burned to ashes. For the first time, Shinjioli's hands and feet began to move before his brain. By the time he regained his senses, he had already left the Sun-Moon sect. He hurriedly used the earth-shrinking technique and rushed towards the vast Sky Empire's capital at lightning speed. Ning Xuema, no matter what, nothing can happen to you. No matter what, I don't want you to die. Shui Lan was about to go crazy. He had never hated himself for not being a doctor as much as he did today. He could still deal with ordinary injuries, but a miscarriage and bleeding profusely, he really didn't have any experience at all. He didn't even know where to touch her to stop this damned bleeding. He could only find a doctor nearby. Find a midwife. Therefore, he boldly carried Ning Xuema, who was covered in blood, and barged into the vast Sky Empire's capital, Fenglai City. This name was changed by Ji Yunhao after he ascended the throne. No one knew what it meant, but it was true that the people were still living and working in peace and contentment. Chapter 1482. Shui Lan usually went into the city in stealth mode, but this time, he couldn't care less. He didn't go through the city gate. Instead, he carried Ning Xuema, who was covered in blood, and descended from the sky. After all, he had been in the city before. Naturally, he knew where the medical centers were and which medical centers had better doctors. Therefore, he directly landed in the courtyard of the medical center. Unfortunately, the doctor in the medical center was more upright. No matter what patient he treated, he had to register and line up. This was the foot of the Son of Heaven, so the people here were very knowledgeable. They had also seen cultivators who could fly. Therefore, when Shui Lan carried Ning Xuema, who was covered in blood, and landed, they were very surprised, but they didn't panic. It was obvious that he had brought someone to see a doctor. Among the people in the line, there was a bold person who saw Shui Lan running directly into the room where the doctor was. He was very angry. Hey, line up, line up. You're not allowed to cut the line. In Shui Lan's dictionary, he didn't know how to write the word line up. He didn't have time to pay attention to those people. He directly kicked open the door of the room, grabbed the doctor inside, and asked him to treat Ning Xuema. The doctor was pulled so hard that he almost fell on top of Ning Xuema, who was covered in blood. He also had a stubborn temper. He straightened his neck and angrily rebuked Shui Lan's bandit behavior. He also said that he would only treat the people in the line. Even if the emperor came, he would have to follow his rules. Shui Lan was furious. Naturally, he threatened him. However, the old man would rather die than break the rules. Shui Lan flew into a rage. However, he didn't have any other way to deal with this kind of old man who could be killed but not humiliated. Naturally, he could use other methods to force the old man to submit. For example, he could use his bloody and thunderous methods to kill the old man's family and all the patients in the hospital. However, if Momo knew about it, she might not be happy. Moreover, it would take time to kill. What's more, he wasn't sure if the old man would be threatened by him. Helplessly, he suddenly knelt down in front of the old man. Illnesses have their priorities, and she really can't be delayed for even a moment. I beg you, please save her. That old man was amenable to coaxing but not coercion. In fact, he had already seen Ning Xuema and knew that her life was indeed at stake, so she could not be delayed. Shui Lan's kneeling gave him a way out, so he raised his head and agreed. She immediately went to see Ning Xuema. Shui Lan stood up and slowly loosened his fingers that had formed a seal. This old man didn't know that he had actually managed to keep his life. Just now, if he had hesitated for even a moment, he would have been slapped by Shui Lan, this great devil, to the point where he was even more miserable than Ning Xuema. The old man took Ning Xuema's pulse for a while and shook his head. Shui Lan stared at him. What do you think? Can she be saved? Madame Gui is a case of miscarriage and hemorrhage. This case is extremely dangerous. 9 out of 10 people die. Madame Gui has already lost a lot of blood. Her blood supply is insufficient, and her own blood is unstable. The old man shook his head and said professional terms. Shui Lan was anxious. He grabbed the old man's collar and said, "Speak human language. Can she be saved or not?" The old man's face and neck turned red. You're such a boorish man. How dare you threaten a doctor like this? Shui Lan's hands that were hidden in his sleeves loosened and clenched. He clenched and loosened again. It was the first time in his life that he had begged someone so humbly. It was the first time he had been so sullen. I really care about her. Can she be saved? Chapter 1483. For the sake of the patient, the old man decided not to argue with him, but he also explained, she is close to the end of her life. I don't know if I can cure her, but I can only try my best. As long as I can stop the bleeding first, I will be halfway to success. Shui Lan naturally agreed and urged him to do it quickly. Ning Xuema's bleeding made him frightened. He had no way to cure her, so he could only place his hopes on these human doctors. It turned out that with Ning Xuema's physique, the human doctors could not be trusted. The old man used his special skills, but there was still no sign of stopping the bleeding. Her face had already turned pale yellow, and she still hadn't opened her eyes. Shui Lan did not know how much psychokinesis Shui Lan had instilled into her, but she did not move again. In the end, the old man shook his head and simply gave Shui Lan an honest advice: don't worry about it. Prepare for her funeral. Shui Lan did not say anything. He did not want to waste any time, so he picked up Ning Xuema and left. The bold man who was angry at Shui Lan for cutting the queue sneered at the side. Who told you to cut the queue? Retribution? He wanted to say a few more words to vent his anger, but he could not say the rest of the words. Because Shui Lan didn't even turn his head and flung his sleeves backwards, that person flew out like a rag bag. With a bang, he smashed through the roof of the clinic, causing chaos. But the chaos was far more than that. Shui Lan also wouldn't give up after seeing just one doctor. He continued to rush into a few more, causing chaos in each of the medical centers. As time went by, he became more and more irritable. Several doctors and patients were directly slapped to the wall by him, almost becoming photos that were hung on the wall. This was still because he had scruples in his heart. Otherwise, none of these people would have survived. He did not know who had seen him 20 years ago. When he was asking for treatment, he trembled and shouted, "Zither demon in red. He's the red-clothed Zither demon." A single stone stirred up 1,000 wolves. The people of this capital city still had a deep impression of the red-clothed Zither demon who had stirred up a storm in the city back then. And so, word spread from 1 to 10, from 10 to 100, from 100 to 1,000. The entire Fenglai city knew about it. Naturally, it also alarmed the imperial palace. The government immediately deployed soldiers and generals to strengthen the guards in the palace. The Minister of Supreme Court also sent out various spies to investigate Shui Lan's movements. This time, the spies didn't have to be too deliberate and immediately reported back. The red-clothed Guqin demon did not seem to have any evil intentions this time. He only wanted to seek medical treatment and cause trouble in various medical centers. He did not even wantonly kill people. Thus, the palace guards finally let out a sigh of relief and ordered them to pay close attention to the red-clothed Zither demon's movements. The various sects and clans also had many spies stationed in the city. Naturally, they also noticed this abnormality. Right after Shui Lan left, the government officials and the informants of the various sects and clans entered the medical centers, all kinds of hustle and bustle. Shui Lan had only been in the capital city for 4 hours, but everyone in the various sects and clans already knew about him. Countless self-proclaimed righteous sects and clans mobilized their troops to take advantage of this opportunity to get rid of him. It was useless. It was all useless. He carried Ning Xuema and crazily kicked more than 10 medical centers. However, each time, he felt more and more despair. Ning Xuema, who was in his arms, was almost lifeless. She lay there limply, as if she had already died. The streets were still bustling with activity. The surrounding shops were connected to one another. Countless people were laughing and chatting among themselves. Shui Lan was still staggering along the streets. Chapter 1484. Shui Lan staggered along the street. In his arms, Ning Xuema's blood was still dripping. Drop by drop, the blood fell on the bluestone, as if red snowflakes were blooming. Perhaps the blood in her body was about to run out, but the speed of the blood flow had already slowed down a bit, following his footsteps to the ground. Her body was also getting colder and colder. She kept her eyes closed, never waking up. There seemed to be tears at the corners of her eyes, but they were already dried by the wind, leaving only a little trace. The corners of his lips were slightly hooked, as if he was smiling, a smile of relief. Perhaps the name of the red-clothed zither demon was too well known, but at this time, many shops had closed their doors. Many people also hid in various shops, but they also watched his figure from various hidden places as he walked past. Even if there were some passers-by who had to walk for one reason or another, they all stuck close to the wall, and then curiously watched him. It's useless. She's clearly a lamp that has run out of oil. There's no need to save her. This old man feels that if you carry her and run wildly, it's better to prepare a coffin for her. Young man, please restrain your grief. She should be a martial artist, right? If she was an ordinary person, she would have already died after losing so much blood. She's only left with her last breath, but she's just struggling at death's door. Forgive this one for being powerless. He had brought her to see all the doctors in the various medical centers, whether they were famous divine doctors or ordinary quacks, but none of them could give him any hope. None of them could wake her up. In this life, Shui Lan had always been the most powerful. Except for the devil ancestor and Shui Emo, he had never knelt to anyone else. But this time, in order to beg those people to save Ning Xuema, in order to fight for a bit of hope, he didn't know how many people he had knelt to. As long as there was one person who could save her, even if he had to kowtow 100 times to that person, it was fine. But, no one. No one could give him hope. Why was it like this? Why was it like this? His Momo had lived so miserably in her previous life and died so miserably. Could it be that she was going to walk the same path as her previous life in this life? If this was God's retribution to the devil, then Momo hadn't done many bad things. She had even saved many people. She had only repaid her debts, but she hadn't done anything truly evil. Why was God tormenting her like this? If this was retribution for the devil, then Shui Lan must have done more evil than her, right? Why didn't the damned heavens come for him? Why did she have to bully his Momo? A murderous and cold aura emanated from his body. The wind lifted the corners of his robe and made it flutter. He had even sought out the imperial physician who worked in the inner court of the imperial palace, but the result was still hopeless. He hugged her and could only watch as her body became colder and colder, and her breath became weaker and weaker. Momo, if something really happens to you this time, I'll bury everyone in this city with you. Shui Lan said fiercely. But his threatening words had no effect on the dying Ning Xuema. She didn't respond at all. Momo. Shui Lan's voice was filled with pain. What do you want me to do? Tell me, what do you want me to do? I don't want you to die. He blankly looked ahead. The street had already become very deserted, but he couldn't see any way out. His future was gloomy. Chapter 1485. Shui Lan, do you really want to save her? Perhaps we have a way. A group of people suddenly appeared and blocked his path. Shui Lan raised his head and looked at those people. It was a group of 8 people, and each one of them was astute and valiant. Although they were all ugly, each one of them was an expert. Shui Lan's eyes narrowed slightly. Although he didn't recognize them, he recognized their clothes. They were from the second largest cultivation sect in Jianghu, the Wind Cloud sect. There were many talented people in this sect, and some of them were extremely skilled in medicine. They were even famous in Jianghu. Perhaps they really had a way. Shui Lan's eyes flashed. He stared at them and repeated, "Do you really have a way?" His voice was slightly trembling. One of the short-bearded people immediately nodded. "Perhaps. We have to see to know." Shui Lan's eyes lit up. He was like a drowning person grabbing onto a piece of driftwood, unwilling to let go no matter what. He raised his sleeve and a soft bed immediately appeared in front of him. He carefully placed Ning Shuama on it. "Take a look. If you can save her, I can give you countless mountains of gold and silver." The short-bearded man slowly walked over and said with a smile, "We don't care about mountains of gold and silver, but we want you to do something. If you do it, I can try to save her. What is it?" The short-bearded man stared at him and said word by word, "Kowtow to us a few times on the street and shout that you, Shui Lan, will always listen to the orders of the Wind Cloud sect." Shui Lan stiffened. He raised his head and looked at him. His thin lips slightly pursed. "What? You don't want to? Then you can just watch her die." The short-bearded man sneered. Then he pulled his companion. "All right, we're leaving. Don't worry about him anymore. If he doesn't want the opportunity that was sent to him, then this girl should die. Others can't do anything about it, right?" His companions naturally echoed loudly and laughed. "I can kneel, but you have to promise to save her," Shui Lan said slowly. The short-bearded man and the others looked at each other. The short-bearded man laughed, "Okay, sure. Then kowtow to me 3 times as a deposit." These people obviously had ill intentions. They didn't think that a great demon like Shui Lan would kneel down in public. They just wanted to take the opportunity to humiliate him. Unexpectedly, Shui Lan's eyes deepened when he heard this. "Good. You must keep your word." He actually knelt down in front of the short-bearded man. The short-bearded man was stunned, his mouth slightly agape. He watched as Shui Lan knelt down and kowtowed, and a fierce look flashed through his eyes. He quickly made a few hand signals to the other brothers, and they immediately dispersed silently. When Shui Lan kowtowed for the second time, 7 of the 8 suddenly attacked him together. Another one pounced towards Ning Shuama, who was on the soft bed. 7 different colored rays of light shot towards Shui Lan from different directions. These people were obviously used to working together. They didn't give Shui Lan any time to react. Moreover, they were all killing moves. The 7 rays of light shot down at the same time, enveloping Shui Lan's entire body. If there were people watching from the side, they wouldn't be able to see his body. Bang! After an earth-shattering sound, the 7 rays of light exploded with a brilliance that was even brighter than lightning. The 7 people were pleasantly surprised. They didn't see Shui Lan dodge. Chapter 1486. It should have hit. They even felt the weapon cut into their flesh. Ah! A long scream resounded through the street. When the light dissipated, there was indeed a corpse on the ground that had been chopped beyond recognition. The 7 people were pleasantly surprised at first, but when they saw the corpse's face, they all turned pale with fright. The corpse on the ground was not Shui Lan, but the person who had just pounced on Ning Shuama, their companion. Shui Lan had already disappeared without a trace. Their expressions changed, and they suddenly raised their heads. They saw Shui Lan standing not far away, holding the dying woman in his arms, but his eyes were fixed in a certain direction. A person landed on the street, his black hair fluttering in the wind along with his white robe, and his silver mask flashed faintly under the sunlight. The 7 people naturally followed Shui Lan's gaze, and when they saw the white-robed person, their eyes lit up. Di Zun. It was actually Di Zun who had appeared here alone. They immediately knelt down and shouted, "We pay our respects to Di Zun." Before their knees touched the ground, a white light flashed across the ground, and their bodies flew out involuntarily. Then, they fell to the ground one after another. It was unknown whether it was a coincidence or Di Zun's punishment, but each of their knees touched the ground, a series of miserable cries sounded, and the 7 people's knees all shattered, and they fell to the ground, unable to stand up again. Di Zun. The 7 people opened their eyes wide, looking at the godlike man. Shinjili did not pay attention to them, and directly walked towards Shui Lan, stretching out his hand, "Give her to me." Shui Lan's expression changed, and he could not help but take a step back. Shinjili's gaze fell on Ning Xuema's body, and his pupils shrank. He staggered a little. Ning Xuema's bloody clothes were already half dry, and her face was pale yellow. Her eyes were slightly closed, and she was lying helplessly in Shui Lan's arms, almost unable to see the rise and fall of her chest. Ding! Another drop of blood fell from the corner of her clothes, and it fell beside Shui Lan's feet. There was no trace of life in her body, and her whole body was like a leaf blown away by the autumn wind. The leaf was withered and yellow, and there was no green. She was like a knife that stabbed into Shinjili's chest. His heart felt like it was going to flip over at that moment. He actually hurt her so badly. How desperate must she have been when he left her, who was so heavily injured, with another woman. While he healed the other women, she was already on the verge of death. Even though he hated her and was determined to cut off all ties with her, he had never thought of taking her life. Xuema. Xuema. I'm sorry. He waved his sleeves, and with a flash of white light, Ning Xuema, who was originally lying in Shui Lan's arms, was now in Shinjili's arms. Originally, he just wanted to immediately heal her, but the moment she was in his arms, his heart felt like it was drowning, and he almost suffocated. It had been 10 years, and in these 10 years, he kept telling himself to give up, to stop thinking about her. But there were many sleepless nights where her figure flashed in front of his eyes. Many times in his dreams, he hugged her, but when he woke up, he was faced with a room full of loneliness. Unknowingly, she had become a demon in his heart that he could not get rid of, and unknowingly, she had become his poppy existence. Now that he held her in his arms again, the familiar feeling and desire overwhelmed him, and it was so familiar that it almost suffocated him. Chapter 1487. The moment he held her in his arms, he had the urge to crush her into his body and never let her leave. She was as light as a leaf floating in the wind. Her eyes were slightly closed and she didn't move at all. Her face was frighteningly pale and her eyelashes were almost transparent. Her once plump lips were dry and pale, without a trace of color. There were no external injuries on her body, but they were more serious than any external injuries. She lay lifelessly in his arms, pale, weak, and without any signs of life. Xuema. Shinjili's heart twitched as if countless needles had been stabbed into it, twisting it inch by inch. He would rather see her as vigorous and lively as she had been in the Heavenly Book Mountains. He did not want to see her so weak. Moreover, her weakness was all because of him. He held Ning Xuema's wrist and took her pulse with trembling fingers. She was like a lamp that had run out of oil. She was really like a lamp that had run out of oil. She had lost almost all the blood in her body. If she was a normal person, she would have died long ago. The only reason she was still alive was because she had a half-immortal body and her soul was strong. Her wrist was ice cold. That coldness seemed to be able to drill into Shinjili's heart through his fingers. After he checked her pulse seriously, his expression changed slightly. Ning Xuema wasn't just suffering from postpartum hemorrhage. She had used some kind of forbidden technique before the hemorrhage. The image of Ning Xuema torturing Lizine like an Azura flashed before his eyes. His heart suddenly tightened. Lizine was someone who had just ascended to heaven rank level 1, and Ning Xuema was earth rank level 9. Logically speaking, Ning Xuema shouldn't be a match for Luzine. However, the scene he saw was that Ning Xuema had the absolute advantage and Luzine couldn't even retaliate. Shinjiuli knew that Ning Xuema was extremely smart and had many tricks up her sleeves in battle. She could often defeat people who were stronger than her and beat them up until they cried for their parents. Even now, the Sun Moon sect still secretly spread the story of how she had slaughtered everyone when she had entered the sect, and how she had beaten up those who were several levels higher than her. Therefore, when he saw Ning Xuema using her absolute advantage to the point that Luzine couldn't retaliate, he didn't feel that this abnormal phenomenon was strange. Now, it seemed that she had used a forbidden technique to temporarily increase her power to achieve that effect. She used this forbidden technique at the cost of burning half of her blood essence. She was also pregnant. Logically speaking, even a little bit of blood essence was extremely precious and would not be wasted easily. Even if she was thinking about the baby in her womb, she shouldn't use such a method that would hurt both sides, unless the child in her womb was gone by then. That was why she was so crazy and reckless. He recalled the moment he saw Ning Xuema. She was covered in blood, and her dress was stained with blood. Her face was frighteningly pale, and her eyes seemed to be burning with fire. She even wanted to kill Luzine in front of him, as if she was her mortal enemy. Could it be that Luzine had already hurt the baby in her womb? When he arrived, she had already miscarried. More than half of the blood on her body was actually her own. Everyone would feel sorry for their child. If she had a miscarriage because of Luzine, then it wouldn't be strange for her to fight Luzine to the death. And what did he do? He slapped her when she just had a miscarriage. And it was on her lower abdomen. Chapter 1488. This made things worse for her, causing her to bleed profusely. At that time, she was already in an extremely dangerous situation, yet he abandoned her and carried someone else away. The truth seemed to be about to surface, causing Shinjiuli's heart to tremble. The fingers that were holding Ning Xuema's wrist trembled slightly. He lowered his eyes to look at her in his embrace. Right now, she was completely lifeless. Her pulse was also intermittent, so weak that he almost couldn't feel it. Even her breathing was almost gone. If he hadn't carefully sensed her, he would have thought that she was all ready. He took a deep breath. Now wasn't the time to think about this. He had to go back and investigate the truth. Right now, he only wanted to save her. Even if she couldn't stay by his side, he still hoped that she could live well. Xuema, I won't let you die. Don't be afraid, I will definitely save you. He took a deep breath and then slowly lowered his head. From the moment the ancestor appeared, the people who had closed their doors on the main street ran out one after another. In just a moment, many people had already gathered around them. Of course, these people didn't dare to really surround them. They only knelt from afar and curiously watched. The most frightening thing was to injure the bones. The pain of broken bones was definitely more ecstasy than any other pain. The 7 disciples of the Storm sect who had their knees broken were already sweating from the pain. If they weren't afraid of the ancestors' heavenly might, they would have howled on the spot. They suppressed the pain and pressed their acupoints. Only then did the pain lessen and they reluctantly raised their heads. Then, they saw an incomparably shocking scene. The ancestor, who had always been aloof and untainted by the mundane world, actually kissed the woman in his embrace. The ancestor was obsessed with cleanliness. This was something that everyone in the continent knew. The woman in his embrace was covered in filth. Even her hair was stuck together with blood. She was so dirty that she couldn't be cured. Yet, the ancestor not only held her in his embrace, he even knelt down and kissed her. The ground was filled with eyeballs. The ancestor's action was simply shocking. Everyone's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Shuilan was standing on the side. He was also stupefied. Originally, he was very unwilling to hand over Momo in his arms to that powerful love rival, but he also understood that if his Momo still wanted to be saved, he could only rely on this person in front of him. Therefore, he clenched his fists to resist the urge to snatch Ning Xuema back. He thought that Shinjiuli would treat Ning Xuema immediately after taking her away, but he did not expect that he would lower his head and kiss her. He was instantly enraged. This bastard. At a time like this, he still wanted to take advantage of Momo? This was intolerable. Shui Lan threw out a palm. Bastard. Who told you to be such a hooligan at this time? He had been running around for half a day and had to endure everyone's supercilious looks. He had a stomach full of pent-up anger, and at this moment, he could no longer suppress it, so this palm strike was exceptionally powerful. A streak of red light shot towards Shinjiuli's back like a bolt of lightning. Although he was angry, he still had a sense of propriety. Shinjiuli was holding Ning Xuema, so he naturally could not attack in front of him. Therefore, he attacked from behind. Careful! Someone cried out in alarm. At this moment, Shinjiuli seemed to be in a daze. He hugged Ning Xuema and kissed her passionately. Shui Lan's red light hit his back. With a bang, everyone seemed to hear the sound of bones breaking. Shinjiuli's face turned slightly pale, but his body did not move at all. His lips never left Ning Xuema's lips. Chapter 1489. Shui Lan was simply speechless. He had seen rapists before, but he had never seen one who didn't care about his life. It was as if he wanted to kiss her even if she died. Wasn't this bastard already engaged to another woman? Why did he still want to take advantage of his Momo? Shui Lan simply wanted to smash Shinjiuli into pieces with one palm. However, that person was still the only hope to save Momo. Shui Lan only felt a wave of anger rush to his head, but he couldn't find a place to vent it. In the blink of an eye, he saw the 7 people from the Storm sect. Those people were also shrewd people. They probably knew that if they continued to stay here, they wouldn't have a good ending. They were just about to roll and crawl away on their hands and feet. Shui Lan's eyes suddenly narrowed. For the sake of Ning Xuema, he was willing to lower his voice to these people and didn't hesitate to kneel down and beg. However, these people wanted to take advantage of the situation to trick and plot against him. Did they really think that he, the Demon Emperor, was fake? Just now, when those people were plotting against him, his heart was actually on guard. The moment those people attacked him, he immediately used his demonic technique to quickly evade and directly threw himself at Ning Xuema, who was lying on the single bed. Helplessly, the 8th person also rushed to the side of the single bed. Just as his hands were about to grab Ning Xuema, a white light flashed and directly wrapped around that person and dragged him in the direction of the other 7 people. Thus, the 7 Wind Cloud sect's disciples killed their companions. Shui Lan understood that the white light was released by Shinjiuli. That strength and that timing were not ordinary. Shinjiuli rarely killed people, but this time, his actions were not ordinary. Because everything had happened too quickly, those people didn't see clearly how their comrade had fallen under his sword. However, looking at the current situation, they had indeed angered the ancestor. Breaking their knees might just be the first punishment. When he was free and had time, he might give them a second punishment. Therefore, even if their legs were hurting unbearably, even if it was too embarrassing to escape in such a state, they couldn't care less. Just as they were about to escape, they heard Shui Lan sneer, "You want to escape after toying with me?" 7 rays of red light shot out from his palms at the same time. They were exactly the same as the red light that had attacked Shinjiuli. Each ray of red light chased after the middle of the back of a person. As a result, the 7 of them could only let out short screams as a bloody hole appeared in their backs. 7 people became 7 corpses. His move shocked the people who were watching from afar. Someone screamed and hurriedly got up and ran away. With one person running, it naturally led the others to run as well. Thus, the onlookers scattered like birds and beasts in the blink of an eye. Shinjiuli seemed to be unaware of everything that was happening around him. He half knelt there and held Ning Xuema in his arms. The way he held her was a little strange, as if he was holding some kind of spell. As he kissed her deeply, Ning Xuema, who originally didn't have the slightest bit of vitality, gradually turned from pale to pale. It was as if new blood had been injected into her body, and finally, there was a little color on her face. Although the color was very faint, it was the hope of life. Shui Lan originally wanted to give Shinjiuli another slap to make him end this lecherous behavior. However, at this moment, when he saw Ning Xuema's complexion, his heart was moved. The red light that had been condensed in his palms slowly dissipated. Shinjiuli's kiss lasted for 7 to 8 minutes. However, to Shui Lan, these 7 to 8 minutes felt as long as a century. Chapter 1490. Finally, Shinjiuli let go of Ning Xuema's lips and raised his head. His face seemed to be much paler than before. His eyes were slightly lowered, and his eyelashes were delicate. There was a faint trace of blood on his lips. As for Ning Xuema's lips, which were originally like flower petals that had been beaten by the wind and rain, they were now a bit brighter. Her eyes were still closed, and she didn't move at all. She just obediently lay in his arms. How is she? Shui Lan finally couldn't hold back and asked. Shinjiuli didn't answer him. He lowered his eyes and looked at her in his arms. He gently pressed a hand on her back and activated his divine telekinesis, circulating it in her body. He looked at her for a moment, paused, and then lowered his head again. Was there an end to this? Shui Lan angrily said, Shinjiuli, you don't have the ability to get close to her. Don't use healing to do something improper. Shinjiuli still ignored him. This time, his lips landed on Ning Xuema's Jusha mole between her eyebrows. Shui Lan. He felt like he had nowhere to vent his anger. How did it feel to watch the person he loved being kissed by a scum, but he couldn't separate them? Shui Lan was so angry that he was about to explode. He clenched his fists and sneered, Shinjiuli, what's the use of you acting like you're in love with her? Let me tell you, Momo's heart has already been broken by you. If you want to treat her, then treat her properly. If you want to kiss her, then go hug your fiancé and kiss her. Momo thinks you're dirty. Shinjiuli's mind was very strong. When he concentrated on something, the shouts of others were like the buzzing of mosquitoes to him. Now, all his energy was on Ning Xuema, who was in his arms, and he didn't hear Shui Lan's shouts at all. His lips touched Ning Xuema's cinnabar mole. One of his hands was pressing on her back while the other hand was forming a spell. He was mumbling something, and a line of blood flowed from his lips into the space between Ning Xuema's eyebrows. After Shui Lan finished yelling, he finally saw that the line of blood on Shinjiuli's lips was connected to Ning Xuema's forehead. The line of blood was not disappearing, and Ning Xuema's face became even redder. What kind of healing technique was this? Shui Lan opened his eyes wide and stopped yelling. He looked at Ning Xuema and saw that her complexion was getting better inch by inch. It was like a withered leaf that was being injected with chlorophyll again. However, Shinjiuli's face was getting paler and paler. Finally, this strange healing technique stopped. Shinjiuli slowly got up with Ning Xuema in his arms. He didn't know if it was because he had been kneeling for too long or because of other reasons, but his body swayed slightly. How is she? Shui Lan asked anxiously. She's fine for now. This time, Shinjiuli finally opened his mouth. He was still hugging her, as if he couldn't bear to let go of her for even a moment. For now? Shui Lan raised his eyebrows. Her soul is weak, and her blood and qi are unstable. She's in danger of bleeding out at any time. I need to use the bone marrow cleansing technique to reorganize her qi. It was rare for Shinjiuli to explain so much. Shui Lan was confused. However, he didn't really understand. This kind of medical knowledge couldn't be learned in a short period of time. How do I do it? I need an absolutely quiet room. Okay, I'll go prepare it. Shui Lan was straightforward. He turned around and disappeared. Shui Lan made this quiet room absolutely clean and absolutely quiet. He had used his power to create this quiet room on a green hillside. Although Shui Lan liked to kill, he was also quite artistic. The room he built had white walls and black tiles, and the windows were quaint and elegant. It was very artistic. Chapter 1491. When Shinjiuli saw this house, his feet paused for a moment. The style of this building was exactly the same as when Shui Lan was living in seclusion with Ning Xuema in the Immortal Kingdom. It seemed like Shui Lan had a special liking for this style of building. When Shui Lan saw Shinjiuli holding Ning Xuema, his heart filled with anger. Even though he knew that this person was here to treat Ning Xuema's illness, when he thought about how he was already engaged to another woman, Shui Lan felt aggrieved for Ning Xuema. He stretched out his hand with a straight face. "Give her to me." Shinjiuli paused for a moment. He held Ning Xuema without any intention of letting go. He took in a light breath and said, "She can't leave my hand right now." His palm had been pressed against Ning Xuema's back the entire time, as if he was transferring his spiritual force to her. Shui Lan gave a cold laugh. "I hope you're not trying to take advantage of her. She has nothing to do with you right now." Shinjiuli did not say anything. "Shinjiuli, even if you save her right now, she won't be grateful to you at all." "I know." Shinjiuli's reply was short and simple. It was already good enough that she didn't stab him when she woke up, so why would she be grateful? Because saving her was more important, Shinjiuli and Shui Lan were too lazy to waste words and directly entered the room to save her. Because they needed absolute silence and no one could disturb them, Shui Lan didn't wait for Shinjiuli to speak and directly went out to be a guard. The method of changing one's marrow was incomparably complicated and there were countless steps. Moreover, it had to be done meticulously and there couldn't be a single mistake. This required the user to be completely focused and not be distracted at all. It was unknown if that bastard Shui Lan did it on purpose or if he only knew how to design this kind of house. The layout of this quiet room was simply a copy of the bedroom Ning Xuema had when she was living in seclusion in the Immortal Empire. Shinjiuli didn't know how long he had lingered outside that room and looked inside countless times, so he was naturally familiar with the layout inside. Now that he saw it again, his heart felt stuffy. 10 years did she and Shui Lan spend in this kind of house? His gaze landed on the bed in the room. It was a rather spacious bed, big enough for 8 people to sleep on. The mattress on top was soft, and the top was a layer of red mattress. Embroidered on the mattress was a fox running in the wilderness. The little fox looked relatively young, with fluffy white fur and 8 tails swaying behind it. Shinjiuli's eyes narrowed once again. This little fox's appearance was exactly the same as Shui Emo when they first met. Even the 8 tails were exactly the same. He looked at the little fox for a moment, then his gaze suddenly moved away. He was an omnipotent god. In his life, there were only things he didn't want and nothing he couldn't obtain. He thought that with his ability, even if the other party came with a certain goal, he could make her change halfway through. He didn't expect, back then, he thought that he could hold her hand for life, but he didn't expect that the two of them would become strangers now. She was now someone else's wife, and even hugging her was a luxury. He could only take advantage of this moment. Shui Lan, that bastard. His wife was pregnant, but he let her run away alone. His gaze swept across the big bed again. Overturning clouds with one turn of the hand, turning red waves with one turn of the hand. He didn't know why, but when these words appeared in his mind, his arm froze. Had she and Shui Lan spent these 10 years on this kind of bed, his chest suddenly felt stuffy. Shinjiuli took a deep breath. He felt that he couldn't think about it anymore. Chapter 1492. If he continued to think about it, he might just tear down the house. Shui Lan, this bastard, must have done it on purpose. He only said that he needed a quiet room, but he didn't say that he needed a well-equipped bedroom. Did he deliberately provoke him? The layout of the house made Shinjiuli have the urge to run away. However, He couldn't find another quiet room. He paused for a moment and waved his sleeves. A layer of sparkling white light flashed, and the unsightly furniture in the room disappeared, especially the big bed, without a trace. There was a white jade bed and a few praying mats in the place. Since he wanted to save someone, he couldn't leave anything unsightly in the house. He didn't want to be distracted and make mistakes during the rescue, which would make him regret it for the rest of his life. Shuilan was sitting on a branch of a big tree outside the small courtyard. This place had a good angle of view. Not only could he see the inside of the small courtyard, he could also see the surrounding scenery. Even if a fly flew over, he would be able to see it and kill it in time. He felt that he was very attentive and thoughtful. The quiet room was decorated according to the style that Momo used to like. When she woke up and saw the familiar layout, she might feel less sad. He was most satisfied with the big bed. Currently, Ning Xuema was still unconscious. To heal her injuries, she needed a comfortable place to lie down. She was injured so badly that Shinjioli might have to circle around her body to save her. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to do that if the bed was too small. Therefore, he specially made a king-sized bed. He was afraid that the bedboard would be too hard for Momo, so he personally made a few layers of bedding. Shuilan stretched his waist on the branch. He had just returned to this world from outer space and encountered such a situation as soon as he came back. He wanted to save someone so badly that he couldn't calm down to think. Now that he had a little free time, he began to think about some things. The first thing that came to his mind was, which bastard caused Momo to have a miscarriage? Who was the father of the child in her belly? He had been separated from her for a full 10 years. When they met again, she was injured and almost unconscious. She only said, "Baby, mommy is coming to accompany you." Her words were like a bomb that shocked him so much that he was at a loss. Because he was in a hurry to save her, he didn't think too much about it. Now, he was puzzled. What had she experienced in the past 10 years? How in the world did she escape from that black hole of a whirlpool? Judging from Shinjioli's reaction, he didn't seem to have much interaction with her in the past 10 years. He didn't even know about the existence of this child, so this child was most likely not his. Then whose child was it? Could it be that Momo met and fell in love with another man in these 10 years, so she had that man's child? But why did she bring someone else's child to Shinjioli's engagement party? She even danced as a gift and smashed the pipa to sever everything. This was a bit like lingering feelings. Was the baby in her belly Shinjioli's? But the timing didn't match. Could it be that Momo and Shinjioli were entangled in this 1 year? But if they were entangled, it was impossible for Shinjioli not to know that the child was his. He wasn't an idiot. It was too strange. It was too hard to understand. Shuilan felt that his brain was about to be tied up. He looked at the quiet house in the distance. There was no movement in the house. Even the curtains were closed, so he couldn't see anything inside. Chapter 1493. Before Shinjioli went in, he had said that no matter what happened in the outside world, he was not to be disturbed. Therefore, although he had a question in his heart, he could not say it for the time being. He looked down at his hands. His fingers were slender and white. These hands had once held the military power of the demon realm. They could summon the wind and summon the rain. But no matter what he did, he could not win the heart of the woman he liked. Now, he did not know whether the woman he loved the most was alive or dead. But he could only sit here and wait hopelessly. The hourglass of time flowed in this anxiety. In the quiet room, Ning Xuema's blood-stained clothes had already disappeared and were replaced by a red dress. The red dress was made from the best quality heavenly silkworm silk. Not only was it light and elegant, it also had the ability to defend against swords and sabers. This red dress was a treasure of the other world. Back then, the chivalrous and evil people in the other world fought to get this red dress. However, Shinjioli took advantage of it. He liked this red dress very much, so he took it back and put it in the storage space. These years, he would often go through the various space doors and go to various other worlds. He would often see things that were suitable for girls. Occasionally, he would buy them on impulse. After buying them, he would feel annoyed and put them in a remote corner of his storage space. He thought that there would never be a day when this red dress would come in handy. He did not expect to use it now. She looked really good in this red dress that he got. But the size was slightly on the plump side. She was obviously pregnant, but her body was thinner than before. Her waist was so slender that it seemed like he could hold it with one hand. Her body was full of bloodstains. It was very eye-catching. Before he treated her, he had to clean her up. When he treated her as his wife, if he encountered such a situation, he would not hesitate to strip her naked and wash her thoroughly with rootless immortal water. But now, no. She was someone else's wife. Even if he could not forget her, he could not be rude at this time. Therefore, he could only continuously use the cleansing incantation on her. Using the cleansing incantation required psychokinesis, and because he had given Ning Shuama a third of her god blood, he was somewhat weak. He knew that if he continued to heal her, he would have to consume a small amount of psychokinesis. He truly felt that his incomparably boundless psychokinesis was somewhat insufficient. When he held her in his arms again, he realized that he still desperately desired her. He longed to the point that he had the impulse to kill Shui Lan outside to prevent any future troubles. But, no. He had already hurt her badly enough. If he killed Shui Lan as well, it was one thing for her to fight him with her life when she woke up, but he was afraid that she would be extremely sad. Therefore, even if Shui Lan was an eyesore, he could not kill him. Perhaps in the future, he would have to send people to protect him, lest he be accidentally destroyed by those cultivation sects. Just thinking about it made him feel vexed. Therefore, Shinjioli simply stopped thinking about it. At this moment, she was lying on the white jade bed that he had prepared with her eyes closed. After he cleaned her up with the cleansing spell, he had already used a spell to put on the red dress for her. Her hair was winding under her body, and the red dress finally reflected a trace of redness on her pretty little face. Red dress, she looked the best in red. This dress looked like a wedding dress. She was lying on the white jade bed that he had prepared for her, just like his bride. Shinjioli took a slight breath and pushed this unreliable thought out of his mind. Chapter 1494. He slowly lifted her up, and the two of them faced each other. He took her hand and interlocked his fingers with hers. She was like a wooden doll, allowing him to play with her. It was rare for her to be so obedient. This was the most intimate position, as if it was the most beautiful time in the past. It was as if he had interlocked his fingers with hers on their wedding night. He had asked her if she regretted marrying him, and told her that he would give her a chance to go back on her words. How did she answer at that time? She said that marrying him was her greatest wish in this life. She said that she would never regret it. After saying that, she even kissed him with a red face. I can't think about it anymore. Now is not the time to think about this. He suppressed those messy thoughts that he shouldn't have at this moment, closed his eyes slightly, and probed her body first. The aura of God's power slowly entered her dantian. That place used to be a breeding ground for demons. At that time, the demon lived here. He remembered that the refining of the copper cauldron didn't completely refine the demon. There should be some remnants inside. It was most likely that it was heavily injured and was sleeping inside. But nothing. He couldn't detect a trace of the demon's aura at all. Her dantian was very normal now. He knew that the demon was very cunning and very good at hiding. Usually, it was easy for people to not detect it, but it couldn't hide from Shinjioli's God's power. Now, even he couldn't sense it. Could it be that the demon had completely disappeared on its own? This wasn't possible. He muttered to himself for a moment, and a thought suddenly appeared in his mind. Could it be that Momo's soul was too strong and took advantage of the demon's weakest moment to completely absorb it? When this thought appeared, it made him stiffen. Absorbing the demon in one's body, even a heaven rank level 4 immortal wouldn't be able to do it, not to mention that Ning Xuema was only at earth rank level 9. It was even more impossible for her to have this ability. Unless she was like him, a natural god, and this was even more impossible. Momo was only a nine-tailed fox in her previous life. She had nothing to do with God. He couldn't figure it out. Since he couldn't think of anything, he temporarily put it aside. No matter what, it was a good thing that the demon in her body had disappeared. Healing her injuries was more important now. He started to get busy, one step after another. His movements were so fast that it made people dazzled. His figure flashed as he circled around her, his fingers quickly tapping on many of her acupoints. This process was very painful for her. Shinjioli had already prepared for her to cry out in pain while she was unconscious. Unexpectedly, she didn't move at all, as if she wasn't the one who was chosen. Was she really not in pain, or had she suffered more pain in the past, so she was numb to it? Her face was slightly pale and beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. However, she pursed her lips and did not make a sound. She did not even make a sound. Although her appearance was not enough to disturb the doctor's state of mind, it made Shinjioli's heart twist. He forced himself to calm down and began the last step. Once again, he pulled her hand over and placed his fingers against hers. He closed his eyes and activated his psychokinesis. Beads of blood appeared on all 10 of his fingers and seeped into her body through her fingers. Marrow cleansing meant that the two of them were connected by blood. The flow of his blood also joined the flow of her blood. It was equivalent to blood circulating between the two of them. Shinjioli's blood was the blood of God. It had the power to purify everything. Even if her blood was exhausted and decayed, it would be rejuvenated and regain its energy under the influence of the blood of God. Chapter 1495. If he succeeded, not only would Ning Xuema's power not decrease, but it would also increase a lot. She might even be able to break through the earth rank and directly enter the heaven rank level 1, which would be a blessing in disguise. What he did not expect was that when his blood entered her body halfway, her originally slow blood flow suddenly started to boil. It was as if there was originally a sleeping dragon inside, and his divine power was an outsider who had invaded its territory. The dragon rose into the air, bared its fangs and brandished its claws to attack the intruder, vowing to drive the intruder out of its body. Shinjioli was caught off guard, and the divine power he released almost fought with the power in Ning Xuema's body. If they really fought, then Ning Xuema's body would become a battlefield, and in the blink of an eye, her body would be destroyed until not even a strand of hair was left. Therefore, he could only desperately withdraw his divine power when he sensed that something was wrong. He withdrew too quickly, and the divine power quickly backfired and directly hit his own body. In an instant, it was as if he had been pierced by thousands of steel needles. His face turned pale, and cold sweat seeped out. He took half a step back and almost fell off the white jade bed. Without his support, Ning Xuema's body tilted to one side and fell to the ground. It was probably because the power in her body was awakened, and it was boiling and clamoring in her body. Shinjioli could even see the veins on the surface of her skin moving like snakes, undulating like tides. Her face, which was originally slightly red, turned pale again. Sweat seeped out from the tip of her nose, and her teeth unconsciously bit down on her lips. Her lips were bitten until they bled, and 2 drops of blood came out. Although Shinjioli did not know what went wrong, he knew that he could not let her go on like this. Ignoring the pain in his body, he rushed to her side and carried her again, using ordinary telekinesis to guide her blood flow. After all, his telekinesis was strong, and ordinary telekinesis would not trigger the power in her body to fight back. After a while, the power in her body was like a little lion that had been successfully pacified, and it finally calmed down. Shinjioli sighed softly and looked down at Ning Xuema in his arms. His gaze was faintly complicated. What exactly was she? This was the first time he had seen such power. He thought for a moment and used his ordinary telekinesis to search her body again, but he couldn't find anything at all. It was as if the mysterious force in her body had finally gone to sleep after defeating the enemy and was dormant again. Shinjioli raised his hand and rubbed the space between his eyebrows. This matter was somewhat difficult to handle. It seemed like he had to carry out Plan B. However, the second plan was a little abrupt, but now, in order to save people, he couldn't care less. He slowly unbuttoned the front of her shirt, revealing her perfect collarbone and exquisite mounds. Her snow-white skin looked even more sparkling and translucent under the reflection of the pearls on top of her head. Although Shinjioli had always had a strong willpower, even if there were more than 10 beautiful and enchanting women dancing in front of him, he would still be able to maintain his composure and not even move his eyebrows. His heart would not have any ripples at all. However, the woman in front of him was the one he had always desired. She was the poppy in his heart that he couldn't bear to part with. In his previous life, he didn't know how many times he had made love with her. In this life, they had also been intimate once, so he was very familiar with her body. At this moment, her clothes were half unbuttoned, and she was half sitting in front of him. That peerless spring scenery still made his mouth dry and his tongue dry. He suddenly moved his eyes away and stabilized his mind. His telekinesis gushed out from his palm and slowly injected into a certain vital acupuncture point on her chest. It quickly moved around her acupuncture point. Chapter 1496. This kind of healing not only tested his willpower, but also his psychokinesis. It consumed twice as much energy as using God's power. He used his psychokinesis to circulate in her body and was surprised to find that her damaged meridians were recovering automatically. Moreover, the speed of recovery was even faster than when he used his psychokinesis to help her recover. Could it be that he had used his God's power to stimulate the mysterious power in her body? Shinjioli heaved a sigh of relief and slowly withdrew his hand. He then helped her to fix her messy clothes. Since she had started to recover automatically, he could no longer participate in it. Otherwise, the recovery speed of the two forces would be different due to the difference in speed. She might even go crazy because of this. What he needed to do now was to stay by her side and check on her recovery speed from time to time. If he found something wrong, he could make some adjustments. She was lying on the white jade bed as if she was sleeping soundly. He sat beside her and looked at her. He was holding one of her hands the whole time. Perhaps they were really deeply in love with each other. He could only stay by her side quietly for this moment. After that, they would go their separate ways and live their own lives. As for this incident, he needed to know the truth and give her an explanation. Unknowingly, 6 hours had passed. After 6 hours, the door of the quiet room finally opened. Shinjioli slowly walked out from inside. His face was extremely pale, but his steps were still very steady. A red shadow flashed. Shuailan floated down and landed directly in front of him. He stared straight into Shinjioli's eyes and asked, "How is it? Is she okay?" His voice was slightly trembling. He was afraid that something bad would come out of Shinjioli's mouth. She should be fine. Shinjioli was a man of few words. He paused and threw out a medicine bottle. "This is the pill she should take every day. Let her take 3 pills every morning." After that, he turned around and disappeared. Shuailan, this person left too straightforwardly. He didn't even have time to ask the question in his heart. Forget it. Those were all secondary. As long as she could survive, as long as she was fine, everything else was fleeting. Luzine had already been moved back to the small courtyard she used to live in. Although she was unconscious, she was blind and crippled. She would tremble from the pain from time to time, so she needed someone to take care of her. So Yelu Jing and still sent 2 female disciples to wait on her. It was not easy to take care of this kind of patient. She had to wipe its sweat from time to time to prevent the sweat from flowing into the wound and causing infection. It was already the middle of the night, and the two disciples were a little tired. One of them was taking a nap on a small bed in the outer room, while the other was dozing off on Luzine's cloud bed. The lights dimmed, and another person suddenly appeared in the room. The female disciple, who was dozing off, opened her eyes in a daze and jumped in fright. He fell to his knees, Di-Zun. She was simply too shocked, so she kowtowed especially loudly. She accidentally knocked her head so hard that she got a bump. An ancestor had unexpectedly broken into this small courtyard in the middle of the night. This had never happened before. She had served Luzine in this courtyard for so many years, but she had never seen Di-Zun. Get out. The ancestor only said 2 words. The disciple didn't say anything else and immediately agreed. She kowtowed again and left, dragging her companion out of the room along with her. Before she left, she didn't forget to close the door for the ancestor. Shinjiuli stood in front of Luzine's bed. Chapter 1497. After half a day of recuperation, the fur on its body no longer looked as dull as before. It was a bit brighter. Its injuries weren't light, and it was still unconscious. If he waited for it to wake up normally, he might have to wait a day, but he didn't want to wait a moment longer. The truth. He urgently needed to know the truth. When he came out of seclusion, Yelu Jing and had reported to him that Luzine had gone to the Forbidden Land to gather herbs for him. He didn't take it to heart at that time. This Forbidden Land was located in the sky above Heavenly Book Mountain. There were herbs everywhere, and there was indeed lightning avoidance grass that could cure lightning tribulations. However, since he had already prepared to block lightning tribulations for Luzine, he naturally considered this step. He had already prepared these herbs, so there was no need for Luzine to interfere. However, since she had already been gone for a day and a night, then let her be. After all, although there were some ferocious guardian beasts in the Forbidden Land, their levels weren't too high. With Luzine's martial arts, it was enough to deal with them. The Forbidden Land wasn't close to the Sun-Moon sect. With Luzine's speed, it was already not bad if she could return in 2 days. Therefore, in his opinion, it was normal for Luzine to go missing for a day and a night. There was nothing to worry about. As for Ning Xuema was the only one that made him a bit worried. Although he knew that they weren't fated and that he shouldn't miss her, reason couldn't completely control his emotions. He still couldn't help but want to know how she was doing. Originally, he still needed to go into seclusion for 2 more days to fully recover. However, in the later stages of his seclusion, he didn't know why he was so impatient and flustered. It was as if something important in his life was disappearing. This was the first time he felt this way. He subconsciously tried to calculate, but he didn't get anything. In this world, the only person he couldn't calculate was Ning Xuema. His first feeling was that something had happened to Ning Xuema. This time, he couldn't stay calm and immediately contacted Yelu Jing and reported that Helian Xiao, who was sent to Phoenix City, had a small accident. He didn't know what Forbidden Land he had accidentally entered, but he encountered a ghost wall. He came out after a day and a night, and was now on the way to Phoenix City. However, the disciples of Phoenix City didn't see Ning Xuema, so he sent people to search along the way. In other words, Ning Xuema was missing. After receiving this news, Shinjiuli became even more impatient. Back then, when he was helping Ning Xuema to expel the devil from her body, in order to protect her soul from being harmed, he had separated a part of his soul from her. Later on, she left with Shuilan with hatred, and he did not take back that part of his soul. With that soul in her body, he could still sense her. Although he couldn't sense her emotions, as long as she was on this continent, he could sense her general location. He immediately focused his senses and sensed, but to his surprise, he discovered that Ning Xuema was actually in the direction of the Heavenly Book Mountain. If she wanted to go to Phoenix City, she would not have passed through Heavenly Book Mountain. Why did she suddenly go to Heavenly Book Mountain? Could it be that he needed to collect some herbs? He knew that Ning Xuema was extremely smart and quick-witted. That disciple who was following her had most likely been detected by her. In order to confuse that disciple, she deliberately flew in the direction of Phoenix City, but she changed her direction not long after flying. That was how she got rid of the disciple sent by Yelu Jing. And no one knew the dangers of Heavenly Book Mountain better than Shinjioli, especially those spirit beasts on the 9th peak. Even an Earth rank level 9 would be in danger at every step. Chapter 1498. When he thought of his inexplicable panic, he became even more impatient. Therefore, he immediately set off, and in the end, he witnessed such a cruel scene. At that time, he was so angry that he didn't think much about it. After he came back from the rescue, he was so busy that he didn't have time to think. It was only when he was guarding Ning Xuema that he really calmed down and thought about it. The more he thought about it, the more frightened he became. The more he thought about it, the colder his limbs became. Ning Xuema was pregnant. With her personality, she would definitely treat the child as a treasure. For the sake of the baby in her womb, she wouldn't purposely find trouble with Lu Xin, whose psychokinesis was higher than hers. Moreover, only Yelu Jing knew that Lu Xin went to the forbidden land of spiritual herbs. Ning Xuema shouldn't have any channels to know about this. Naturally, she wouldn't purposely go to Tianshu Mountain to find trouble with Lu Xin. At first, he thought that the two of them just met on a narrow path. Now, it seemed that things were far from that simple. It was highly likely that Lu Xin took the initiative to find trouble with Ning Xuema. If he wanted to find out the truth quickly, he could only find Lu Xin. Therefore, he rushed back in the middle of the night and went to her room. He looked down at the nine-tailed fox on the bed. Lu Xin seemed to still be unconscious. Her body trembled from time to time, and she groaned in pain. Obviously, even if she was unconscious, she still felt pain. Shinjioli paused. He couldn't wait any longer. He reached out his hand and was about to use spells to wake her up when he suddenly paused. After looking at her for a moment, he suddenly said, "You don't have to pretend anymore. I know you're awake." Lu Xin's body trembled, and her ears trembled. She couldn't open her eyes anymore. She turned her head and faced Shinjioli's direction. She groaned again, as if she was crying out her grievances. However, her tongue was gone, and her abdomen was pierced. She had just repaired it, so she couldn't speak ventriloquism. 2 drops of blood dripped from her eyes, as if they were tears. She looked very miserable, but Shinjioli was unmoved. He slowly said, "Let me ask you, how did you meet Ning Xuema?" Lu Xin's body stiffened. She couldn't say a word. She whimpered and cried even more profusely. Shinjioli narrowed his eyes slightly. "I need to know the truth. Since you can't speak now, let me read your memories." This sentence caused Lu Xin's entire body to freeze. It was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, it shrank back and shook its head desperately. It endured the sharp pain in its abdomen and spoke in ventriloquism, "No need. I can write with my hand." Its claws had been reattached. Although it could not use its power, it could still write. It was afraid that Shinjioli would read its memories and obtain information, so it ignored the pain all over its body. With a flash of light, it was about to return to its human form so that it could write. However, just as the light on its body flickered, it felt a sudden chill on its forehead. A finger was placed between its eyebrows. His fingers were so cold that Lu Xin couldn't help but shiver. Her nose was filled with Shinjioli's unique light fragrance. Lu Xin originally wanted to get close to him, but now she was so scared that her whole body trembled. She didn't expect Shinjioli to have this ability. Reading memories. Once he read her memories, wouldn't all her secrets be exposed? Woo-woo. She wanted to shake her head violently, but Shinjioli's finger seemed to have fixed her in place. She couldn't move at all. Chapter 1499. It felt a sharp pain in its forehead. It could feel that everything related to Ning Xuema was frantically flying out of its mind. Shinjiuli didn't read people's memories easily. Although this was the fastest way to find out the truth, it wasn't challenging at all. If he found out everything through reading people's memories, it would be much less fun. His life was endless. In his long and boring life, he needed to cultivate some fun. It wouldn't be good if this fun was taken away. Unless he was anxious to find out the truth, he wouldn't use this method. He also didn't remember when he had been criticized by others when he used this method. It seemed that he had angered them and left a strong psychological shadow in his heart. Even when he woke up again this time, he didn't rely on reading other people's memories to recover his own memories. He had been watching Lizine's reaction. Therefore, Lizine's every little action fell into his eyes. She was obviously feeling guilty. She obviously wanted to lie. Then why should he be polite? He immediately used the technique to read her memories. Of course, he only took a portion of her memories. It started after the tribulation. He saw that after the tribulation, Lizine was recuperating in the small courtyard. Every day, she would ask about him 7 to 8 times. He saw that after her injuries were more or less healed, she walked around in the house alone with a heavy heart. He saw that she came out for a walk and accidentally saw Yelu Jing and Helian Xiao talking together. He heard that Ning Xuema was heading to Phoenix City. He saw that she walked away thoughtfully and returned to her own house to take a few things. Then, she came out and told Yelu Jing, and that she was going to look for medicine for her master. He saw that after she left the Sun-Moon sect, she quickly caught up with Helian Xiao and set up a trap in front of him. She made Helian Xiao fall into the illusion of the Sea of Clouds. He saw that she forced Helian Xiao's soul out of the illusion of the Sea of Clouds and used a technique to depict his actions and the way he spoke. In the end, she made Helian Xiao unconscious and trapped him somewhere. Then, she secretly caught up with Ning Xuema, who was flying on her sword. When he saw Ning Xuema in Lizine's memories, Shinjiuli's fingers trembled slightly. At that time, Ning Xuema's face was extremely pale, but her eyes were extremely bright. From time to time, she would caress her abdomen and murmur, "Baby, mommy will take you to eat good food. I will definitely let you eat the best food and grow strong. Your father doesn't want you anymore. Mommy will dote on you twice as much. I won't let you feel like a child without a father. Baby, I'm sorry. Mommy wasn't strong enough. I fell sick just because of a little shock. You suffered because of me. But mommy loves you very much. You didn't take any medicine even when you had such a high fever. Mommy's physical cooling is also good. After soaking in the bath for a few days, my skin was about to cramp. But I finally got through it. It's just that the staff there must be wondering why I'm bathing so frequently. They might even think that mommy is sick. Huh, mommy is sick, she's sick in love with her son. Her face was full of motherly radiance as she chatted with the baby in her stomach. When he saw this, Shinjiuli's face was already pale. Who exactly was the father of the child in her stomach? If it was Shuilan's, how could he not want to have the child? He faintly guessed something in his heart, but he didn't dare to believe it. When he heard her say, physical cooling, he seemed to have understood something. His heart couldn't help but twist. So, she had fallen sick in that poor little town, she had fallen seriously ill in that poor place, and there wasn't even anyone by her side to take care of her. Chapter 1500. She was seriously ill in such a poor place, and there was no one around to take care of her. She could only rely on baths to cool herself down. How helpless must she have been at that time? That damned spy actually didn't see through her. He only said that she lived in seclusion and liked to bathe. He even said that when he saw her occasionally, he saw her walking gracefully and her complexion wasn't bad. That's right, she had to be strong and had the identity of a demon king. If she showed any signs of weakness, she was afraid that she would be hunted down by the celestial cultivation sect. Therefore, she had to be strong. Shuema. Shuema. Shinjuli's fingertips, which were pressed on Luzine's forehead, were already turning white. Then, he saw Luzine muttering viciously to herself, "I definitely can't let you give birth to this child. Otherwise, I won't have any hope." He then saw Luzine rushing in front of Ning Shuema and setting up a poisonous enchantment. Ning Shuema was obviously absent-minded as she barged into the enchantment. Shinjuli's fingers began to tremble. He was a medical expert. Although Luzine's poison was extremely secretive, she couldn't hide it from his eyes. This kind of poison was nothing to ordinary people, but it had an extremely strong abortion effect. Luzine was indeed plotting against Ning Shuema's child. He already knew what kind of feelings Luzine had for him. However, since he didn't have any feelings for her, he naturally treated her feelings as nothing. He had already fulfilled his promise by blocking the lightning tribulation for her. There was no need to get involved with her anymore. He thought that he had made everything clear and that Luzine had also understood. However, he didn't expect that she didn't give up at all. She actually plotted against Ning Shuema. Why did she plot against Ning Shuema's child? Could it be that the child, Shinjuli, didn't dare to think further? His heart seemed to have sunk into the abyss. The finger pressing on Luzine's forehead trembled so much that it almost slipped off. As the memories flashed in his mind, Shinjuli's face turned paler and paler. When he saw Luzine transforming into Hellion Shao to trick Ning Shuema into eating the falling blossom peach, his fingers turned cold. He couldn't wait to walk into the scene and knock the falling baby peach out of Ning Shuema's hand. Fortunately, Ning Shuema was smart enough to see through Luzine's scheme and expose her identity in time. To Shinjuli, what happened after that was no different from being struck by lightning from the ninth heaven. That child was actually his. His own. Although he didn't know what Ning Shuema had gone through in the past 10 years, he still understood Luzine's supernatural ability. He knew that she had a pair of X-ray eyes, and he had even experienced it himself. It was indeed magical. However, he didn't expect that she would know that Ning Shuema's child was his. Instead of telling him, she directly schemed against Ning Shuema. Luzine's memories were still surging in his mind. Shinjuli's face turned pale as he watched Ning Shuema desperately trying to protect the child and fighting a battle of wits and courage with Luzine. He watched as she sat on a huge rock and used her psychokinesis to protect the child. He watched as her eyes stared blankly. She was obviously scared to death, but her fingers were moving very quickly. She kept muttering to herself, hopelessly begging the baby in her womb to be strong and not leave her. Shinjuli felt as if a few knives were stabbing into his heart, but he could only watch as she helplessly worked. When the blood came out from under her skirt, he saw her frozen in place. She looked as if the whole world was leaving her. Shinjuli's heart felt as if it had fallen into hell. Blood gushed out from under her skirt, and she could only work in vain and mechanically. Chapter 1501. Blood gushed out from under her dress as she worked in vain like a robot. She was like a wooden doll that had been beaten into a pulp, but she was still holding onto a sliver of hope. He even saw her using a very thick silver needle to stab a certain acupuncture point on her body. That acupuncture point was used to protect the fetus, but it was several times more painful than other acupuncture points. However, she kept stabbing as if she didn't feel pain, trying to keep the baby, until the last moment, a small ball of flesh rolled out from under her dress. She was trembling like a fallen leaf in the wind. She held the small ball of flesh in her palm, and her eyes were dark and full of despair. Her dress was stained with blood, but she was as pale as a ghost. Shinjuli's face was also as pale as a ghost at this moment. This was obviously Luzine's memory, but he could also feel Ning Shuema's overwhelming despair and sadness in this memory. That kind of despair and sadness seemed to be shared by heaven and earth. The flowers withered at that moment, and the chill spread like a tide. At that moment, Ning Shuema turned into a demon. After some time, Shinjiuli's finger that was pressed between Luzine's eyebrows finally slid down slowly. His face was frighteningly pale, and he stood there motionlessly. He lowered his head to look at his hand, and his fingers were twitching. No wonder Ning Xuema would fight with Luzine. So this was the reason. And what about him? What did he do? What did he do? He injured her, who had just had a miscarriage, and then left her, who was on the verge of death, with the enemy who killed their child. Shinjiuli, I hate you. This was the last thing she said to him. He didn't think much of it at that time, but now he finally understood how much she wanted to cry for him. He treated her enemy, but he caused her to struggle on the verge of death, and she was on the verge of death several times. She was his wife. The wife who was pregnant with his baby. She must have wanted to give him a surprise when she came back with the baby, but she didn't expect to hear his engagement ceremony. Ning Xuema's words when she came to the engagement ceremony seemed to ring in his ears. Shinjiuli, do you really want to marry her? She had always been strong and proud. Was she trying to get him back by asking that question? However, he had directly said, it has nothing to do with you, which had directly killed all her hopes. When he blocked the lightning tribulation for that woman, she went down the mountain alone in despair. That woman was only slightly injured, but he sent 2 of his disciples to take care of her carefully, and ate all kinds of delicacies every day. His wife, who was pregnant with his child, had a high fever in a poor and run-down city, and no one cared about her. She wanted to eat a good meal for her child, and she had to travel to another city. In the end, he even injured her for the sake of that woman, who not only had a miscarriage but also used a forbidden technique, causing her to bleed profusely. Xuema, Ning Xuema, the woman he loved wholeheartedly. He had always thought that he had never let her down and had always had a clear conscience, but it turned out that he had already caused her so much irreparable harm. Shinjiuli's fingers were trembling, and his whole body was shaking uncontrollably. What had he done? What had he done? His vision turned black, and there was blood boiling in his chest. Even the iron of Jojo couldn't cast the word regret in his heart. Layers of regret surged in his chest like a tidal wave, and finally, it rushed up to his throat, causing him to spit out a mouthful of blood. Luzine knew that it was over the moment his fingers left her body. She was terrified. Chapter 1502. Although she couldn't see Shinjiuli's expression, she could still sense what was going on around her. She could feel that the temperature around her was dropping rapidly. The majestic murderous aura coming from him made all the fur on her body stand up and her whole body tremble. The strong pressure made it so that she couldn't even raise her head. No, she had to do something. Otherwise, she might be beaten to death. She couldn't care less about the pain in her stomach from talking. She tried her best to speak. Brother D, please don't be angry. I know I'm wrong. I didn't want to kill her. I just wanted to get rid of the child in her stomach. Bang! Before Luzine could finish her sentence, she was swept away by a strong gust of wind. She smashed into the wall and slid down. The soft couch under her body was smashed into pieces. She couldn't even see its original shape. This caused the wounds that Luzine tried so hard to heal to reopen. Her vision turned black and she almost fainted. Blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. Luzine, I didn't do anything wrong to you. Why did you scheme against her? Why did you scheme against my child? Shinjiuli's voice came from above her head. Luzine crawled towards him with trembling claws. Brother D, you misunderstood. I didn't want to harm you. You couldn't forget her all these years. When you were unconscious, you often called her name in your dreams. That woman caused you so much trouble. I didn't want her to bother you anymore. I was afraid that she would use the child to threaten you and force you to do this and that, so I took the risk, to scheme against her. I didn't want to kill her. Before her claws touched the corner of Shinjiuli's robe, he waved his sleeve and swatted her away like he was swatting away a fly. With a bang, she hit the wall again. How dare you interfere in my affairs? Luzine, you're courting death. Shinjuli's tone was cold and icy. You harmed her child. She hurt your body. You've harmed my wife and child, so I'll destroy your soul. Shinjuli clenched his fist in the air, and Luzine's body seemed to be lifted up by an invisible hand. In the next moment, as long as a white light appeared in his palm, 10 Luzines would be killed. Even his soul couldn't reincarnate. Luzine was so frightened that she screamed, "Brother D, Zine knows her mistake. Zine would never dare to do it again." Zine had already been punished, hadn't she? "I beg you to spare Zine this time on account of my father saving your life." Shinjuli looked at the 9-tailed fox that was hanging upside down and dripping with blood. He narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "Luzine, your father entrusted you to me before he passed away. I promised to help you overcome the lightning tribulation and cure your old illness. Now that I have fulfilled my promise, I don't owe you anything anymore. However, you harmed my wife and child. You must pay for this." He slowly clenched his fist. Luzine's body felt as if it was being bound by an invisible iron hoop, causing her head to swell. If she still had eyes, her eyeballs would have been squeezed out. She couldn't speak anymore. Only her 4 limbs and tail were left trembling and spasming. All the wounds on her body had opened up, and it was several times more painful than before. Knowing that it was futile, she gave up on struggling. So be it. Her body was already in such a bad state. She had hoped that Shinjuli, who was omnipotent, would be able to change her eyes, reattach her tongue, heal her wounds, and restore her to her original state. Chapter 1503. She even had a secret hope in her heart. She hoped that Shinjuli would treat her well out of guilt. Not only would he heal her, but he would also not chase her away. She might even be able to benefit from this disaster and stay by Shinjuli's side for a long time to become his woman. But now everything was hopeless. Even if he did not kill her, he would not heal her. She would rather die than live in such a miserable state. Just when she could no longer breathe, the invisible iron hoop around her suddenly loosened. She fell to the ground and raised her head in panic. "I won't kill you." Shinjuli's voice was cold. Hearing this, Luzine did not feel relieved at all. She wanted to speak again, but her abdomen was injured again. She could not even speak. "I will order people to send you back to Jade Water and announce your true identity. Take care of yourself." Shinjuli did not look at her again and turned to leave. Luzine was scared out of her wits. The foxes in Jade Water valued family the most and cared a lot for the little foxes. If they knew that she was the one who caused all the female foxes to miscarry, she was afraid that they would skin her alive. She clearly remembered that she had used that poison technique at the very end in Jade Water, causing the children of several Fox clan elders to die an unnatural death. Those Fox clan elders had sworn with bloodshot eyes that they would skin the culprit alive once they caught her. No. If that was the case, she might as well die now. She struggled to get up and clenched her teeth. Using the last bit of her vital core, she desperately tried to hit the wall. Poof! She did not hit the wall but hit a soft enchantment. Her heart sank and she raised her head. She heard a soft sigh. "Luzine, you brought this upon yourself." Luzine whimpered and shrank back. She could already tell that the voice belonged to Yelujing, and also felt very miserable. He was summoned by his master in the middle of the night. After giving him a few instructions, his master turned and left. Now he had to clean up this mess. A few days ago, his master had instructed him to send Luzine back to the country of Jade Water after she had passed the lightning tribulation and recovered from her injuries. He also planned to have some fun in the country of Jade Water and see other fox spirits. Who would have thought? He didn't expect Luzine, who always liked to smile and looked like a fairy, to be such a woman. She had once done such a thing. This caused his good impression of her to drop to the negatives. Before his master left, he had instructed him to send Luzine back alive. Naturally, he couldn't let this woman commit suicide here, although Yelu Jing didn't know what had happened during this period of time, but since master had saved her and treated her with great care, and then heavily injured her to this extent, and even gave such a strict order, then she must have done something that angered both man and God, and angered master. Luzine, to be able to infuriate my master and make him give such a cruel order, you are really capable. Yelu Jing didn't care about Lu Ziyin's desperate struggle as he casually placed it into a box and brought it out. He always carried out his master's orders to the letter. What awaited Lu Ziyin was another round of severe punishment. Yelu Jing could almost foresee Lu Ziyin's tragic future. He knocked on the box floating beside him and sighed. I really think that you would be better off dead. This woman was really blind. Of all the people she could offend, she just had to offend his master. He had to finish this task quickly. When he returned, there was an even bigger task waiting for him. Chapter 1504. Master told him to prepare a wedding, and he only gave him 6 words, the grandest, the grandest. In just a few words, it showed how much importance Master placed on this wedding. Master's attitude was completely different from when he told him to prepare an engagement banquet. He vaguely guessed something in his heart and became excited. Could it be? Little junior sister was finally coming back. Woo-woo. A muffled sound came from the box that was enveloped by psychokinesis. It was obvious that Luzine was extremely uncomfortable inside. She was seriously injured now, and she was traveling in the sky where she couldn't breathe. She could only rely on the air produced by his box to breathe. His psychokinesis was limited, and it was already good enough that he could protect the box. He didn't have the extra strength to produce enough air for her, so she could only endure it even if she was suffocating inside. However, Master had told him not to let her die. He had to let her live to receive the punishment that she deserved. She would live, at least for 10 years. But the injuries on her body would never heal. She would always experience the pain of not being able to live and not being able to die. She would never be free. No one in this world dared to go against Dizun's decree. He believed that the Jade Water Fox clan wouldn't dare to either. Shinjili was flying towards the capital of Chongkong country, his speed as fast as a shooting star. His heart was beating fast in his chest, sweet and sour at the same time. It was as if there was a pot of boiling water in his chest that was going to boil at any time. She loved him. Otherwise, she wouldn't have kept this child, his child. If he hadn't read Luzine's memory, he wouldn't have believed it. He was the only god in this world. He was the strongest and had the highest magical power, but he also had a fatal weakness. The power of a god was too strong, so it was not easy for him to conceive a child. Even if he married a high-level deity, she might not be able to conceive a child for him after 8 to 10,000 years. He didn't expect that Ning Shuama, who was only at Earth rank level 9, could do it. His child. That was his child. If he knew that she was pregnant with his child, he wouldn't have let her go no matter what. He would have kept her by his side even if he had to use the method of confinement. He was really a bastard. That was obviously his wife, obviously his person, but he actually almost gave her away. Shuama, wait for me. I'm coming to take you home. I will make it up to you. I will do my best to make it up to you. I won't let you get hurt again. The voice transmission talisman at his waist suddenly lit up. He looked down and saw a bright red light flashing. His heart sank. It was a message from Shui Lan. When he left the last time, he was afraid that Ning Shuema would have another accident, so when he gave Shui Lan the medicine bottle, he also gave him a sound-transmitting talisman so that he could contact him if he was in trouble. Looking at the flashing blood-red sound-transmitting talisman, Shinjioli was stunned for a moment. Could it be? Something happened to Ning Shuema? He took a deep breath and picked up the sound-transmitting talisman with trembling hands. Shui Lan's exasperated voice came from the other side. Shinjiuli, how did you treat her? Something happened to her. Shinjiuli's expression changed. He almost fell from the cloud. What happened to her? She seems. She doesn't recognize people anymore. I can't say. Come and see her, she doesn't recognize people anymore? Amnesia? Shinjiuli almost couldn't catch his breath. She couldn't have lost her memory like him, right? It didn't matter. Whether she lost her memory or not, he wouldn't let her leave his side again. At most, he would chase her back. Chapter 1505. Shinjiuli had originally planned on making a trip to Heavenly Book Mountain to summon the soul of his child, but now he had to go and see his child's mother first. In reality, Ning Xuema's situation was far worse than Shinjiuli had imagined. She really had woken up, but her wide-open eyes were unfocused. When Shinjiuli arrived, Shui Lan was circling Ning Xuema, calling out to her, but she did not respond. Seeing Shinjiuli come in, he jumped up, his dark green eyes turning scarlet. He reached out to pull at Shinjiuli's clothes. Bastard, just what kind of curse did you cast on her body? Shinjiuli brushed him aside with his sleeve and sat down by Ning Xuema's side. Without another word, he took her hand and checked her pulse. Although her pulse was weak, it could be considered normal. There was nothing wrong with it. Moreover, from her appearance, she should have woken up, but no matter how he called out to her, she would not respond. It was as if she had lost her soul and had become a wooden puppet. She was also very obedient, allowing Shinjiuli to move her around. When he told her to open her mouth, she opened her mouth. When he told her to stretch out her hand, she stretched out her hand. She had no intention of resisting. However, her originally lively eyes were dark and deathly still. It was as if they were an icy wasteland, devoid of any green. Shinjiuli examined her soul. Her 3 spiritual and 7 physical souls were all there. Not a single one was missing. She was not suffering from a soulless illness. Just what is going on? Did she lose too much blood and hurt her brain? Shui Lan raised his suspicions. Shinjiuli ignored him. At this time, he could not panic. He could not be confused. He had to calm down. Shinjiuli suppressed his panic and busied himself around her. She was not suffering from a soulless illness or a lack of physical souls. There was also nothing wrong with her body. Even her brain was normal, without any damage. There was not a single illness that he knew of that could be related to her. Then what was wrong with her? Xuema. Shinjiuli stretched out his arms and hugged her tightly. His heart was filled with regret. She didn't move and let him hug her. She didn't push him away, nor did she respond. Her eyes were still staring blankly ahead. Shui Lan was furious. Shinjiuli, I asked you to treat her, not to take advantage of her. Shinjiuli turned a deaf ear to Shui Lan's scolding. He just hugged her, and felt her soul aura. Time ticked by. 2 hours passed. 4 hours passed. The sky outside was already bright, and the sun was just right. It was a rare sunny day, suitable for hiking, traveling, and having fun with friends. Inside the room, the 2 people's hearts were filled with dark clouds. Shui Lan couldn't intervene, so he could only watch from the side. Shinjiuli had been busy for a few hours, but there was still no effect. The once lively girl was now like a lifeless porcelain doll. She couldn't see anyone. Although she was still alive, she was no different from a dead person. What's wrong with her? Shui Lan finally lost his patience. Shinjiuli still didn't speak, but his hands and feet were a little cold. This was the first time he had seen this kind of illness. He was a god. Although his medical skills were excellent, he wouldn't treat people easily. If it was some complicated illness related to psychokinesis or injuries from practicing martial arts, it wouldn't be a problem for him. Even if she had lost her soul, he could still call her back. But this was not the case now. For the first time in his life, he felt helpless. Her fragrant and soft body was in his arms, but it seemed to be thousands of miles away from him. Chapter 1506. No matter how hard he tried, he wasn't able to touch her soul. Shuema. Ning Shuema. Shui Emo. Momo. He called out the name he had once called out, and he even used his telekinesis. Even if she was deaf, his voice would still reach the deepest part of her body and be received by her. But she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her eyes were wide open, empty. Shuilan steeled his heart. He took out a needle from somewhere and asked, "How about I stab her where it hurts the most?" "No need. It's useless." Shinjili finally opened his golden mouth. He slowly bent down and picked her up, turned around, and walked away. "Hey, where are you going?" Shuilan chased after him. "I'm taking her to see a doctor." Shinjili was a man of action. As he spoke, he had already soared into the air. Shuilan naturally wasn't willing to be left behind. He also flew up. "Where do you want to see a doctor?" Was there anyone in this world who was better than Shinjili in terms of medical skills? Carefree Island. Shinjili spat out a few words. His feet moved, and he flew even faster. Rongyue Tianlan often walked the human world and called himself the immortal doctor. He boasted that there was no illness in this world that he couldn't cure. He claimed that he could cure all difficult and complicated illnesses. Now, he could only take Ning Shuima to find him. Hopefully, he had a way. After all, Shuilan had been in the demon world for a long time. He naturally had some understanding of the characters of the immortal world. Therefore, although Rongyue Tianlan kept a low profile and almost never dealt with demons, he had still heard of him. The legendary immortal doctor might really be able to cure Momo. Although Shuilan's fighting skills were inferior to Shinjili's, his running skills were still quite good. Shinjili was extremely fast, but he was actually able to keep up with his footsteps. The two of them were originally destined to be enemies, but now, for the same woman, they had abandoned their former enmity and traveled together. "Give her to me." Shuilan impolitely extended his hand to Shinjili. Since this god couldn't save Momo, then there was no need for him to look at his face and endure his tyranny. Shinjili glanced at him indifferently. "Why should I give my people to you?" Shuilan was stunned and his expression changed. "What do you mean?" "I meant it literally," Shinjili replied. "Bastard. What do you mean by your people? You don't deserve her at all. You're already engaged to another woman. You have no right to get her." Shuilan was furious. "There's no engagement, and there's no other woman. She's the only woman I've ever had." "Nonsense. What's the matter with Luzine? Your engagement is known to the whole world. Momo has just returned and she already hears about it. How can she endure this?" Shuilan was furious. No one knew Ning Shuima's feelings for Shinjili better than him. When that silly girl was with him, she would often be lost in thought. When she saw a man in a white robe on the street, her gaze would uncontrollably follow him for a long time. At that time, although she never said anything and even deliberately looked happy, he could see the unhappiness in her eyes. He saw the kind of unforgettable yearning that she couldn't forget even if she wanted to. Occasionally, in her dreams, she would call out to the great god. When she called out to him, she would stubbornly raise the corner of her mouth, but tears would often seep out from the corners of her eyes. Shuilan, who was secretly observing her, felt as if a basin of boiling water had been poured over his heart. It was as if he was scalded. That boiling water instantly turned cold, so cold that his heart couldn't help but tighten. Chapter 1507. On the surface, she looked happy and carefree, as if she had walked out of her gloominess. However, her heart was always empty. She agreed to try with Shui Lan, but every time he deliberately got close to her, she would subconsciously avoid him. When he hugged her waist, her body would stiffen. She was lost in thought more than she was happy. Shui Lan had tasted this kind of lovesickness before, so he naturally understood what this meant. She was lovesick. However, the person she was lovesick for was never Shui Lan. It was like this in the previous life, and it was still like this in this life. No matter how much that person hurt her, no matter how much she hated that person, it had nothing to do with Shui Lan. He couldn't even be the person she hated the most, whether it was love or hate. She was happy, angry, sad, or happy for the same person. She was extraordinarily stubborn when it came to relationships. This made Shui Lan gnash his teeth in hatred, but he also felt a little sad. Wasn't he also stubborn? Was this fate? He couldn't let go of her, and was crazy for her. However, she couldn't let go of another man, and was heartbroken for that man, because he knew Ning Xuema's feelings. When Shui Lan returned 10 years ago and heard that Shinjiuli was engaged and Ning Xuema used a dance to send him off, his first reaction was heartache. He knew that the girl would definitely suffer a heavy blow because of this. After leaving the Sun Moon sect, he didn't know where she would hide to recover. Therefore, he frantically searched for her. It wasn't to obtain her, but to be by her side, to give her a shoulder to lean on when she was the saddest. However, he didn't expect that he would find her so heavily injured. Which bastard hurt her? If I find out who it was, I will definitely tear him to pieces. Shui Lan said fiercely. Shinjiuli's expression changed slightly. Looking at Ning Xuema in his arms, he felt as if a knife was slowly stirring in his heart. The one who hurt her the most was him, and the one who caused her to be like this was him. He was clearly the most important person to her, but he hurt her so deeply. He didn't dare to imagine how Lizine felt when he left with her. Shinjiuli, you'll regret it. You'll regret treating me like this. These were the last words she said to him. He didn't look back at that time, so he didn't see her expression, but he could imagine it now. How desperate did she have to be to say those words? Yes, he regretted it. He had long regretted it. He was so regretful that he wished he could turn back time and stab himself a few more times. He took a deep breath. At this moment, he naturally could not tell Shui Lan the truth. Otherwise, this red coat bastard would definitely fight him to the death. He wasn't afraid of fighting Shui Lan. If Shui Lan beat him up because of this, he would rather not fight back. However, right now, treating Ning Xuema was more important. Everything else had to be put aside. Where have you been for the past 10 years? What happened? Shinjiuli finally asked the question in his heart. He didn't dare to ask this question before, but now, he finally asked it openly. Shui Lan obviously didn't buy his words. What does it have to do with you where we've been? It's none of your business. Shinjiuli glanced at him. If he didn't know about this child and heard Shui Lan's answer, he most likely wouldn't ask anymore. However, he was really curious now. Although he forced himself to let go and seemed to have forgotten about Ning Xuema on the surface, he often subconsciously traveled to different spaces. Chapter 1508. He still had a sliver of hope in his heart. He hoped that he could sense her and meet her by chance. However, he didn't. He had never met them. This made him feel even more hopeless. From time to time, there would be rumors from the demon realm that the two demon kings were already married. The two of them lived together when they were in the demon realm. Now, the two of them went out to have fun. There were all kinds of rumors, but none of them could be confirmed. Every rumor was like a knife that stabbed into his heart. Therefore, he forced himself to let go completely. Later on, there was a rumor from the demon realm that Shui Lan didn't appear because he was seriously injured and his life was in danger. Because of this, when Ning Xuema appeared at his wedding, his first reaction was that she was here for Shui Lan again. He didn't expect that everything was wrong. She was here for him. In her previous life, she might have loved Shui Lan, but in this life, she loved him. If she really loved Shui Lan, she wouldn't keep the child. She was a doctor herself. If she didn't want to keep the child, she had many ways to do so. Therefore, since he knew what she was thinking, he didn't want to let go no matter what. Even if she wanted to cut him with a knife after she woke up, he didn't care. He also had his own pride. If she had always loved someone else, he would let her go. If she loved him, he wouldn't let anyone else take advantage of her. Shui Lan, the child in her stomach is mine. Shinjiuli calmly threw out such a bomb. Shui Lan staggered and almost fell from the cloud. What nonsense are you talking about? This year, you and her have. How dare you let her down and get engaged to another woman? Shui Lan was furious. I just found out. At the engagement party, I met her for the first time after 10 years, that's not right. Momo's child is only 3 or 4 months old. You haven't seen her before. How could it be yours? Shui Lan looked at him as if he was looking at a monster. That's what I'm wondering too. This child is mine, but we were indeed separated for 10 years. That's why I'm asking you about the past 10 years. Shui Lan coldly snorted, why should I tell you? Besides, do you think the child is yours just because you say so? I'll only believe it if Momo says it herself after she wakes up. Shui Lan, some strange things have happened to her in the past 10 years. Perhaps this is the main reason for her strange illness. If you tell us, the doctors will be able to prescribe the right medicine. Shinjuli's words clearly poked at Shui Lan's weak spot. He paused, took a deep breath, and coldly said, 10 years ago, she and I accidentally entered a barren land and had a few words. She left by herself. When I chased after her, I could only watch as she was swallowed by a strange black hole. Shui Lan still didn't know what happened between Ning Xuema and Shinjiuli. He also didn't know whether the child was real or not. Therefore, he didn't want to tell Shinjiuli the truth. What if the child in Momo's stomach was someone else? If Shinjiuli knew the cause of Shui Mo's death in his previous life, wouldn't he be even more unwilling to let go of Momo? Moreover, this great god had a fiancée in the Sun Moon sect. Even if his Momo liked Shinjiuli, she wouldn't be able to accept this. His Momo deserved to be treated as the only one, and Shinjiuli obviously didn't deserve it. Besides, Shui Lan wasn't ready to let go before he confirmed Ning Xuema's feelings. Chapter 1509. Moreover, Shui Lan wasn't prepared to let go of Ning Xuema before he could determine her feelings. He had persisted for 2 lifetimes. He wasn't someone who would easily give up now. Shinjiuli naturally didn't know that he was hiding the truth. His attention had been drawn to that black hole. He often walked there, so he naturally knew of that black hole. It was a famous place where those who entered never returned. Ning Xuema had actually been swallowed by that black hole? Shinjiuli's hands and feet turned cold. He angrily glared at Shui Lan. If she was lost in there, why didn't you come to find me? Find you? Shinjiuli, don't tell me you went into that black hole. Also, after that black hole swallowed her, it immediately disappeared. I also wanted to jump in, but I ended up jumping into thin air. I've been looking for this black hole for all these years, but I haven't been able to find it. Shui Lan didn't plan on mentioning how he had gotten lost. He didn't want to ruin his image in front of his love rival. So, you separated 10 years ago? Nonsense. Shinjiuli looked down at Ning Xuema in his arms. A thought suddenly appeared in his mind. Could it be that time in that black hole world was slower than here? A day in that world was a year here? Or perhaps it was a similar time system. She might have only stayed in that black hole for 1 or 2 months, so the child in her belly was only 3 or 4 months old. But here, 10 years had already passed. He could only wait for her to completely wake up before he could obtain an answer. Shinjioli closed his eyes. His speed suddenly increased. As he flew, he suddenly used the distance shrinking technique. Shuilan wasn't prepared for this and was immediately pulled away. Shuilan could only watch on helplessly as Shinjioli disappeared in front of him. The only thing left in the air was the words that almost made Shuilan stomp his feet. Shuilan, you can leave now. Shuilan, this great divinity, was burning the bridge after crossing it. He actually left him behind and ran away. Humph, did he think he could leave him behind? Wasn't it just Carefree Island? It's not like I don't recognize him. Rong Yuetian looked at the supreme god descending from the sky and knocked her head with her fan. When she saw the person in his arms clearly, her head swelled even more. Rong Yuetianlan was a leisurely loose immortal. She had an elegant temperament and an undisciplined temperament. Although she lived on the Tianxi continent, she didn't care about the various immortals and devils on this continent. She lived a carefree and unfettered life. Of course, that was 2,000 years ago before he met the Divine Lord. Rongyue Tianlan had a hobby. He liked to hunt for treasures, but he didn't necessarily care about the treasures. What he liked was the process of searching for treasures. 2,000 years ago, when he was searching for treasures, he entered a mysterious cave. Before he could see any treasures, he was attacked by Wu Mo. Wu Mo sternly warned him to get lost as soon as possible, saying that this was not a place he could come to. Rong Yu Tianlan had a stubborn temper. The more he was not allowed to enter a place, the more he wanted to enter. The more Wu Mo refused to let him enter, the more he believed that there must be a peerless treasure hidden in the cave. Generally, the value of the person or beast guarding the treasure was directly proportional to the value of the treasure. The more powerful the person guarding the treasure, the higher the value of the treasure. Wu Mo's martial arts couldn't be compared to those guardian beasts. He could be considered an expert among experts. Therefore, the treasure he was guarding must be a heaven-defying treasure. With this inference, Rongyue Tianlan defeated Wu Mo and pinned him there. Then, he excitedly rushed into the depths of the cave. As a result, he saw the supreme god lying on an ancient white jade bed. Chapter 15:10. The supreme god was in a deep sleep and his body was covered with a faint white light. What made Rongyue Tianlan even more surprised was that the appearance of this sleeping handsome man was 99% similar to that of Wu Mo, who was fixed outside by her. Rongyue Tianlan thought that they were twins, one in a deep sleep and the other guarding. Although the supreme god lying on the bed was unbelievably handsome, Rongyue Tianlan did not have any thoughts. Firstly, he was an extremely handsome man. He once thought that he was the most handsome immortal in the world. Secondly, his sexual orientation was very normal. He was not interested in handsome men no matter how beautiful they were. Therefore, he was a little disappointed when he saw that there was only one heaven-shaking, earth-shattering man on the ancient white jade bed. He spent so much effort to enter the treasure mountain, there was no reason for him to go out empty-handed. Therefore, he waved his fan and walked around the ancient white jade bed a few times. He planned to bring the ancient white jade bed home. He felt that the texture of the ancient bed was very good. He could bring it home to put some jars and jars of things. Of course, he was embarrassed to let the man on the jade bed sleep on the ground. Therefore, he planned to make an ancient rattan bed for him to sleep on when he took away the white jade bed. He was an immortal, so he was still very kind. He was embarrassed to do something so immoral. He did not expect that after he walked around the ancient bed twice and thought about which room to put the bed home, the supreme god woke up. The supreme god had just woken up from a dream and was still confused. Although he did not have any memory, his IQ was still very high. He could see that the man waving the fan in front of him was thinking about his bed. The more memories a person had, the more guarded they were against the outside world. They were also very rude to people who invaded their territory. Rongyue Tianlan did not take the supreme god seriously at that time. According to his general inference, they were twins after all. The one outside was just so-so, how strong could the one sleeping inside be? Therefore, the two of them did not agree and immediately fought. Therefore, Rongyue Tianlan finally realized how wrong his general inference was. The kung fu of the one inside and the one outside could not be mentioned in the same breath. Rongyue Tianlan was beaten up badly. Now that he thought about it, he felt bitter tears. It was from then on that he finally got to know the Supreme God. Because of a moment of greed, he became the Supreme God's follower. Fortunately, the Almighty was a man of character and didn't order him around much. He would only occasionally play chess with him, chat with him, or ask him to save someone. Overall, the Almighty still treated him as a friend. From then on, when the great god fell asleep again, Wu Mo was no longer the only one guarding him. There was also Rongyue Tianlan. Rongyue Tianlan focused on enjoyment, unlike Wu Mo who was rigid and boring. Originally, when the great god was about to fall asleep, he would find a very remote corner where no one could find him. After knowing Rongyue Tianlan, the great god would come to find him every time he was about to fall asleep. Rongyue Ishanlan would arrange for him to rest in a place within Carefree Island that was rich in spiritual strength and guaranteed not to be disturbed. She would protect him for 10 years. It was only when he woke up that she introduced herself to him, who had lost his memories, in a sincere and earnest manner. Of course, he also handed over the ancestor's memory record, which he had written in advance, so that he could familiarize himself with it. The first 2 times the ancestor fell asleep, there were no accidents and everything was very peaceful. But he never thought that the 3rd time the ancestor would have such a great accident. Chapter 15:11. The sovereign had fallen into a coma 100 years in advance. When Rong Tianlan received the news from the sovereign and rushed over, the sovereign had nearly been incinerated in that land of flames. The injuries he received were not ordinary. Rongyue Ishanlan used all of his strength and consumed countless pills and countless amounts of willpower to restore him to normal. After the sovereign fell into a normal coma, Rongyue Ishanlan had consumed nearly 2/3 of his strength. His entire body was pale and he couldn't even maintain his carefree appearance. He could only have Yunshi, who was a guest at Carefree Island, help protect the sovereign while he went into seclusion to recover. He knew that the sovereign would wake up in 10 years, so he had set a time limit of 10 years for himself to leave seclusion. This way, he wouldn't delay anything. What he didn't expect was that the sovereign would wake up 2 years early. What left him even more speechless was that because he had been too anxious to recover during his seclusion, his energy had diverged and he had fallen into a state of madness, falling into a coma. By the time he woke up, 10 years had passed. At that time, he was paralyzed in his cave and couldn't leave. He had to cultivate for another 3 years before leaving. By the time he left seclusion, the sovereign's situation had already changed. Ning Xuema had entered the demonic path and disappeared with Shuilan. Shinjiuli had brought back Lezine from the Jadewater Fox clan. It was rumored that the sovereign and Lezine had a good relationship and the two were often together. When Rongyue Ishanlan heard this news, he didn't know whether he should be happy for the sovereign or sad for him. He was deeply aware that before the sovereign lost his memories, he had feelings for Ning Xuema. It wasn't just an ordinary affection. He had almost announced to the world that she was his wife. For her, he had risked his life and used forbidden techniques several times to save her. Rongyue Ishanlan even suspected that Shinjiuli's early coma was related to his frequent use of forbidden techniques. As for Ning Xuema, Rongyue Ishanlan also appreciated her. She was an extremely smart and strong girl. Her only flaw was that she had a bad fate. She was a cursed star and would easily bring bad luck to those around her. Rongyue Ishanlan didn't know Ning Xuema's true identity. First, the sovereign's mouth was tight and he couldn't dig out any information. Secondly, Ning Xuema was very meticulous. He didn't know that she was a transmigrator. What he knew about the relationship between Shinjioli and Ning Xuema was that Shinjioli had risked his life for Ning Xuema several times. As for whether Ning Xuema loved Di Zun or not, to be honest, he wasn't there most of the time, so he couldn't tell. Di Zun was not a person who liked to share his emotions with his good friends. Therefore, Rongyu Tianlan did not know about the interactions between Di Zun and Ning Xuema. He only knew that the ancestor cared a lot about Ning Xuema, more than anyone else. When he came out of seclusion, Yinshi was a guest on his island. He could see that this lass was in a daze. Therefore, he asked for the reason, and Yinshi told him about what had happened in the past few years. Yinshi was in despair. She thought that she would have a chance after Ning Xuema entered the demon realm and became a demon emperor. However, she didn't expect that Shinjioli would treat her harshly after that. He didn't even allow her to go to Tianin Peak as a guest. It was obvious that he had cut all ties with her. Yinshi was naturally unwilling to accept this result. She wanted to visit him several times, but she was afraid that she would offend him and cause him to fall out with her completely. Later, she thought of a way to have a chance encounter with Di Zun. However, she didn't expect that she would meet Di Zun and a little vixen together. Di Zun treated the little vixen well. He would get her whatever she wanted. Chapter 15-12. This scene dealt a heavy blow to Yunshi. After a few days of absent-mindedness, she began to inquire about Luzine and the sovereign. What she heard was similar to what Ning Xuema later heard. The sovereign was very good to this Luzine. He would occasionally take her out to play, and when they went out to play, he would even buy her things. She also looked at Luzine from afar. She was a rare nine-tailed fox, and she looked like an immortal that was floating in the air. When the two of them stood together, they looked very compatible. Thus, Yunshi became even more dispirited and ran to Carefree Island. After Rongyue Tianlan left seclusion, Yunshi naturally told him everything. She was pale and haggard, and as a good friend, Rongyue Tianlan felt distressed. Now that things had developed to this point, Rongyue Tianlan had no choice but to seriously persuade Yunshi to let go. It was time to wake up from this dream. The scene of falling flowers falling in love but the heartless flowing water was a tragic one. It didn't suit her at all. Letting go in time was the way of the king. She didn't want to lose herself and become repulsive. Perhaps they wouldn't even be friends in the future. His persuasion didn't beat around the bush this time. To Yunshi, it was no less than a wake-up call. She finally understood that whether or not Shinjioli had Ning Xuema by his side, it was impossible for them to be together. Although this realization was cruel, it wasn't too late. She finally considered leaving. She promised Rongyue Tianlan that she would think about it and then leave. Rongyue Tianlan was very curious about the sovereign and the little fox after he lost his memories. Thus, he packed up and waved his fan as he went to visit. Shinjioli naturally didn't recognize him. Luckily, the sovereign wasn't impulsive and didn't kick him out when he saw him. Besides, Rongyue Tianlan had several things that belonged to the sovereign. He had proof that they were friends. Moreover, they had a special sound-transmitting talisman. Thus, after some conversation, Shinjioli recognized him as a friend. In truth, Rongyue Tianlan couldn't help but feel curious about the legendary little fox. Thus, he asked the sovereign about her in a roundabout way. The sovereign wasn't a talkative person. He only said, "She's cultivating and isn't on the mountain." Rongyue Tian only met Luzine half a year after that visit. There was no other reason other than Shinjioli bringing her to see a doctor so that Rongyue Tianlan could see if there was a way. After Rongyue Tianlan's diagnosis, she came to a conclusion that Luzine had a weak disease in her womb. She had to undergo the lightning tribulation within 3,000 years of age. If she couldn't undergo the lightning tribulation in time, her soul would dissipate. This conclusion was the same as the ancestors. Rongyu Ishinlan had also tested Luzine's telekinesis. Her aptitude was average, and she had only reached Earth Stage 9 after cultivating for nearly 3,000 years. There were only 5 years left before the deadline. In other words, if Luzine couldn't reach Heaven Stage 1 within 5 years, she wouldn't be able to pass the lightning tribulation. What awaited her was only death. It could be seen that Dizun was very troubled by this matter. Rongyu Tianlan steeled her heart and gave all the medicinal pills that could improve her skills to the little fox. She only hoped that she could be promoted in time to experience the thunder tribulation. However, the little fox didn't live up to expectations. Even after feeding her so many medicinal pills, it still didn't have much effect. The speed at which her skills improved was shockingly slow. In these few years, Rongyu Tianlan and the sovereign had tried all kinds of methods to help the little fox level up, but to no avail. In the blink of an eye, it was the last year of Luzine's life. It was also the 10th year of Ning Xuema's disappearance. Chapter 1513. In the blink of an eye, it was the last year of Luzine's lifespan, which was also the 10th year of Ning Xuema's disappearance. If Luzine couldn't successfully trigger the lightning tribulation, she could only wait for death. Seeing that the deadline was approaching, Rongyu Ishinlan was so anxious that a few strands of his hair were messed up. He could only ask Dizun, what if little fox couldn't trigger the lightning tribulation on the last day? Dizun was silent for a long time. In the end, he only said a few words, a god's promise is worth 10,000 gold. I will let her experience the lightning tribulation as scheduled. Just as Rongyu Ishinlan was wondering what method Dizun would use to trigger the lightning tribulation, news came from the Sun-Moon sect that Dizun and Luzine were going to be engaged. Thus, Rongyu Ishinlan calmed down. On the day of Dizun's engagement, he couldn't be bothered to go. What was there to attend an engagement ceremony that was just to fool the heavens and trigger the lightning tribulation? After that, he heard that the engagement didn't happen because Luzine just happened to be promoted. After successfully triggering the lightning tribulation, Dizun helped her block it and then went into seclusion. Rongyu Ishinlan finally heaved a sigh of relief. He originally planned to visit in a few days. Who would have thought that Dizun would actually come down from the sky today and even carry a person? Ning Xuema was in a daze. She was as obedient as a little wooden puppet. Wherever he put her, she would stay there. Although her eyes were black, they didn't have any luster. It was as if she had sunk into an unknown place where no one could enter and no one could come out. Rongyu Ishinlan diagnosed her for a long time and finally came to a conclusion: this is a bit like autism. Shinjiuli raised his head and looked at him. It was obvious that he had never heard of this term. Rongyu Ishinlan sighed. Most of this illness is inborn, but a small part of it is caused by severe stimulation in the later stages. This kind of patient has no sense of the outside world. Her consciousness only hides in her own world. Shinjiuli didn't want to listen to him talk about medicine, so he asked, is there a way to treat it? Rongyu Ishinlan looked at Shinjiuli, who kept holding Ning Xuema in his arms, and asked an irrelevant question. Dizun, Miss Ning, should be Shui Lan's wife now, right? I think she just had a miscarriage. Why don't you call Shui Lan over? Why did you call him? Rongyu Ishinlan coughed. Xiao Xian has a method that can be tried, but that method is a little, well, it's best to let the person closest to her do it. It would be best if Shui Lan is her husband. Shinjiuli didn't look too good. Who told you that Shui Lan is her husband? Rong Yuetian raised her eyebrows. Wasn't that what everyone in the Jianghu said? Moreover, she had just had a miscarriage, and the only person who had been close to her for the past 10 years was Shui Lan. Therefore, it was obvious who the father of the child was. Shinjiuli said indifferently, she has nothing to do with Shui Lan. The child in her belly is mine. It was like a sudden clap of thunder. Rongyu Ishinlan was stunned. But, Dizun, Xiao Xian remembers that you and Miss Ning haven't seen each other for 10 years. How can she have your child? There are other secrets to this matter. You don't have to ask anymore. What exactly is that method of yours? How confident are you? Shinjili was very straightforward. He only cared about the most important thing. Rongyu Ishinlan scratched her head with her fan. I saw this method in an ancient book. I haven't used it specifically, so I can only try. Shinjili was speechless. So he was the first one to encounter this? How will your method harm her? Chapter 15-14. It's not harmful to her, but it might be dangerous to you, Di-Zun. Also, you might have to sacrifice your body. Shinjili was speechless. He said expressionlessly, tell me the specific steps. Thus, Rongyu Ishinlan coughed and told him the specific steps shamelessly. Shinjili looked at him for a moment. Where did you learn such a wretched method from? Rongyu Ishinlan coughed again. I found that book in a cave in another world. It said that this method was passed down by an ancient god called Supremacy Guyao. I've never heard of it. Rongyu Ishinlan smiled apologetically. I've never heard of it either. However, since he's a god from another world, his method should be useful, right? Of course, if you don't want to use this method, let me think for a few more days. Maybe there are other methods. No need. Shinjili carried Ning Shuama and turned to leave. Prepare a quiet room. Shinjili had woken up in this quiet room. This was the room that Shinjili had woken up in. It was extremely clean and had rich spiritual qi. A huge bed was placed in the middle of the room. The bed curtains were painted with complicated spell patterns using cinnabar. There was no wind in the room, but the bed curtains swayed like waves, causing the spell patterns to sway and flash with light. Shinjili gently placed Ning Shuama on the bed and kissed her on the lips. Shuama, I'll definitely call you back. I'll never let you leave me. Ning Shuama didn't speak or move. She only looked at the empty space with her dark eyes without any luster. She obediently let him fiddle with her and let him take off her layers of clothes. As her clothes were taken off, her white jade-like skin was revealed inch by inch. Shinjili tried his best to calm his mind and not let himself be distracted. He had cultivated for many years and had almost no sexual desires. Before he met Ning Shuama, he had no such thoughts at all. Later, Ning Shuama returned as his disciple. Not long after they met, he had the desire to hug her. The more they touched, the more he had the urge to pounce on her when he saw her in front of him. Later on, he had forced himself upon her out of anger. Not long after, he had recovered the memories of Shui Emo. Only then did he realize that he and Shui Emo had already had many intimate encounters. She was the poppy in his life. Even though he knew it was poisonous, he would gladly endure it. After not seeing her for 10 years, he missed her so much that he was about to go crazy. Now that she had returned to his embrace, when she appeared in front of him like a white sheep, no matter how high his cultivation was, he could not control himself. He abruptly averted his gaze and quickly took off his robe as well. Then, he jumped onto the bed and pulled her into his embrace. According to Rongyue Tianlan, they had to meet naked. He had to hold her in his arms and sit facing each other. Then, he would press a few acupoints on her back and the back of her head and let his mind power slowly penetrate. When their auras were completely intertwined, he could use the soul-chasing technique to enter her consciousness, find her main soul inside, and bring her out. When Shinjili held Ning Shuama in his arms, he felt that he had used this method before. However, he couldn't remember when he had used it. The woman in his arms had smooth and soft skin. The touch was extraordinarily good. Shinjili closed his eyes slightly and tried his best to control his mind. After all, he was anxious to save her, so this kind of test was nothing to him. Chapter 15-15. Shinjiuli closed his eyes, trying to control his mind. After all, he was in a hurry to save someone, so this sort of test wasn't much to him. He was also a god, so his ability to control himself wasn't ordinary. Thus, he was able to completely calm down after a moment. He followed Rongyu Ishinlan's instructions step by step. The two people's skin were tightly pressed against each other, hugging each other like Siamese fish. They could hear each other's breaths. This was an extremely intimate position that could only be done between husband and wife. Shinjiuli was incomparably glad that he knew that the child was his and that she wasn't Shui Lan's wife. Otherwise, if he knew this method, he would only be able to helplessly watch as Shui Lan did it for Ning Shuima. He was afraid that he would have the impulse to destroy Carefree Island. His deep blue eyes stared into Ning Shuima's inky black pupils. Then, he allowed his soul to slowly enter her spiritual sea. Everyone had 7 emotions and 6 desires. Thus, the spiritual sea was often grotesque and strange. Thoughts came one after another, and each thought could cause a soul to fly out. Thus, Rongyu Ishinlan had solemnly told him that the main soul's thoughts should be the most powerful and also the most beautiful. This was because that was what the main soul yearned for. Then, as Shinjiuli entered, his heart sank. Her spiritual sea was pitch black, as if it were a dark black hole, without any color at all. As soon as he entered, he stepped into a despairing darkness. He couldn't see the way out, nor could he see the way back. Shuima. Shuima. He walked forwards in her spiritual sea, calling out to her over and over again, but he didn't receive any response. How could this be? Where was her main soul? He searched frantically inside, looking left and right, hoping to find a trace of her. Everything in front of him was pitch black, as if a bottomless abyss would appear at his feet. He didn't care about anything else, he only wanted to find her and bring her back. However, her main soul seemed to have disappeared, and even all of her hopes had disappeared. He stumbled around for a long time but still couldn't find her shadow. Dizwa, you must remember that you can't stay in her sea of consciousness for more than 4 hours. If you do, your soul will be seriously injured and might even be devoured by her sea of consciousness, never to come out again. This was what Rongyu Tianlan had told him. He had been inside for almost 4 hours, but he still had nothing to show for it. Rongyu Tianlan sat in his own room. He kept staring at the incense stick that represented the time. The incense stick was getting shorter and shorter, and was about to burn to the end, but there was still no movement from the ancestor's side. In the end, he couldn't hold himself back any longer. He placed his hand on the incense stick that he had cast a spell on. Through this incense stick, he could interact with the venerable sovereign who had entered his knowledge sea twice. Dizwa, how is it? The time is almost up. If you can't find her main soul, you can come out first. You can use it again after you have some rest. Shinjiuli didn't say anything. This method could be used again, but it would have to wait for a month, and he didn't want to wait for another day. He didn't want to give up until the last moment. Suddenly, there was a flicker of white light in front of him. His heart moved, and he couldn't help but rush towards the flickering white light. Then, he found that he had landed on a street full of snow. The snow on the ground was a foot deep, and stepping on it was like stepping into a quagmire. In her sea of consciousness, Shinjiuli couldn't use any spells. He couldn't even use his lightness skill, so as to avoid shaking her sea of consciousness and causing it to collapse completely. Therefore, he could only trudge through the snow with 1 foot deep and 1 foot shallow. Chapter 15-16. This street was supposed to be bustling, but in his sea of consciousness, it was terrifyingly quiet. Dense snowflakes danced in the air, and the cold wind blew the snowflakes onto his face. It was as cold as a knife. There was not a single person on the street, and the shops on both sides were in ruins. It was as if this was an ancient city that had been abandoned for a long time. Where was this? Shinjiuli couldn't help but look around. He vaguely felt that this was Bulow City. However, Bulow City was as warm as spring all year round, and every shop was as gorgeous as possible. How could it be as silent as this place? Suddenly, a thin figure appeared in front of him. Shinjiuli's heart thumped violently. Ningxue. She had finally appeared. He had finally found her. He didn't dare to call out to her. The sea of consciousness was constantly changing, and if he alarmed her, she might disappear immediately. He used a little light body technique and quickly ran behind her. He formed a seal with his hand and lifted his hand to grab her shoulder. Shuama. However, he grabbed nothing. His hand passed through her body, and he couldn't grab her at all. Ningxue continued to walk forward, and she didn't even turn back to look at him. Shinjiuli was stunned on the spot for a moment. His technique had always worked on capturing souls, so why didn't it work this time? He watched as she walked into the distance again, and he hurriedly followed her. He rushed in front of her, and when he finally saw her face, his heart turned cold. Her small face was blank, and there was no expression. She only walked, mechanically walking, and trudged aimlessly on this cold and lonely street. He reached out to hug her, but what he hugged was nothing. He couldn't see any hope in her eyes. Her soul and her body were the same, as if they were just mechanically alive. Shuama. He called out to her again and again, but she didn't respond. Suddenly, a clothing store appeared in front of him, and that clothing store was actually of normal color. It became the only color on the entire street. Shinjiuli's vision blurred, and Ningxue suddenly disappeared. His heart sank. While he was anxiously looking for her, he discovered that she had appeared in the clothing store. Her attire had also changed. Her head and face were covered in dirt, and she looked a little down and out. However, her eyes were extremely bright, just like her usual appearance. She was talking to the boss of the clothing store. From time to time, she would take a piece of paper and scribble on it. Shinjiuli walked over and looked at the paper she had drawn. Then, he froze. What was drawn on the paper were sets of children's clothes. There were boys' clothes and girls' clothes. Every set was exquisitely designed and beautiful. It was clear that the designer had put in a lot of effort. The shop owner watched from the side and exclaimed from time to time. In the end, he couldn't help but ask, "Young lady, are you going to order it for a boy or a girl?" Ningxue said without hesitation, "It's still too young. I don't know if it's a boy or a girl. Give me a few sets of each. Even if one of them is not useful now, it will be useful in the future. It's always good to be prepared." The shop owner smiled, "Young lady, you haven't even given birth to this child yet, but you're already preparing for the second one. You and your husband must be very loving." Ningxue's finger that was drawing paused, but then she smiled again, "Of course, we will definitely be very loving. I want to give birth to a bunch of little monkeys for him. He has always liked peace and quiet. I'll let these children disturb him to death." When she said this, her eyes curved into crescents and she was full of smiles. Chapter 15-17. When she said this, her eyes were full of smiles, and there was even a hint of pride at the corner of her lips. Obviously, she was looking forward to the future that she had outlined. She finally finished the drawings and handed them to the shop owner solemnly. She told her to tailor them carefully and that money was not a problem. The shop owner agreed readily. When she sent her out, she added, "Next time, come with your husband to get these little clothes. He will be very happy when he sees them." Ningxue flipped her long hair and looked back with a free and easy smile, "Of course. I'm going to find him now. He will definitely come with me." Shinjiuli watched from the side. His face was pale, and his heart felt like it was being stabbed by a knife. He finally understood that this should be the first place Ningxue came back from the black hole. At that time, she was still full of hope for him and the future. She still hoped that he would come with her to get those little clothes. And what did he bring to her? It was a complete nightmare. He couldn't help but follow her out. He looked at her hand caressing her belly and muttering to herself, "Baby, Mommy finally brought you back alive. I was really afraid that I couldn't come back. I was really afraid that I couldn't protect you. I was really afraid that I would never see him again. You must be laughing at Mommy for being so disappointing. You are so useless to miss a man. I don't look like the domineering agent I used to be, right?" She looked up at the sky and sighed softly, "But I just miss him. I only love him in my previous life and in this life. I want to forget him, but I can't." She sighed again. "In my previous life, I was the one who wronged him first. I stabbed him for a friend. At that time, I thought that he was a god and he wouldn't die even if I took a little blood from his heart. I didn't expect. Fortunately, Mommy was brave enough at that time. In order to revive him, I used the forbidden technique of the demon world and banished myself to the dark place. I made myself a coffin and killed myself. I used the fate of being a jinx in the future in exchange for his rebirth. It's so hateful that he always thought that his revival was only due to Long Chuan. In fact, I also contributed to it. When we meet this time, I will make it clear to him. If he still thinks about this, I won't let my baby call him daddy anymore." Shinjioli, who was listening at the side, was thunderstruck. He staggered. His face was extremely pale. There was actually such a complicated story behind his resurrection. She had actually ended up like this in her previous life, so this was how her fate as a heavenly cursed lone star came about. He followed beside Ning Shuema and watched as she bought a set of beautiful clothes for herself. After putting it on, she twirled in a circle. "Baby, isn't Mommy very beautiful now? I must amaze him." Shinjioli stared at her blankly. His outstretched arms trembled slightly, and he wanted to hug her tightly. "Shuema. Shuema." Just as he stretched out his arm, a violent gust of wind rose in front of him, and turbid water poured down from the sky, instantly drowning the small city that had just recovered its vitality. The world became dark again, and there was no sign of life. "Shuema." Shinjioli watched as Ning Shuema, who was still twirling in front of him, was swept away by the turbid water. He pounced forward and grabbed her waving arm. His palm had clearly touched her arm, but it still passed through like before. He couldn't grab her body at all, and could only watch as she was swallowed by the turbid water. She didn't look at him from beginning to end, and she didn't even struggle when she was swallowed by the turbid water, as if she had already accepted her fate. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.